Section 1 of Stories of the Rhine by Erckmann-Chatrian. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ben Tucker. My illustrious friend Selsam. 1. The evening of the 19th of September, 1855, I went to pay a visit to my old university comrade, the illustrious Dr. Selsam, professor of general pathology, lecturer on clinical surgery, accoucheur of the Grand Duchess, etc., etc. I found him alone in his fine drawing room in the Bergstrasse, with his elbow resting on a small black marble table, and his eyes fixed on a crystal globe containing, as far as I could discern, nothing but very clear spring water. In spite of the purple rays of sunset which invaded the room through 3 lofty windows which once looked into the palace gardens, my friend Selsam's lean physiognomy, the razor-like sharpness of his nose, and his long pointed chin borrowed a frightfully wan hue from the reflection of the glass globe. He looked like a freshly severed head, and the red collar of his dressing gown heightened the illusion. The whole effect struck me so forcibly that I did not dare to interrupt his reflections. In fact, I was on the point of retiring without disturbing him, had not the fat porter, whom I had passed snoring in the anteroom, happened to rouse himself and call out in his most imposing tones, "Monsieur the Councillor Theodore Killian!" Selsam sighed, turned his head mechanically towards me, held out his hand, and said, "Salve tibi, Theodore, quomodo valles, optime, Adrian," replied I. Then raising my voice, I continued, "My friend, what are you doing there? Are you thinking over Sangrado's doctrine by yourself?" His face suddenly assumed such an ambiguous expression that I was quite astonished at it. "Theodore," he began after a moment's silence, "this is no subject for joking. I am studying the complaint of your respected aunt, Dame Anna Wunderlich. What you related to me yesterday respecting it is very serious, this extravagance of ideas, these transports of rapture, these starts, and more than all the exaggeration of expressions employed by the sensible old lady when speaking of Haydn's creation, Handel's oratorios, and Beethoven's symphonies all presage a dangerous attack of illness. And you believe you have found a remedy for it in that bottle of water?" "Precisely. Chance has brought you hither at a most opportune moment. I was just thinking of you." Then pointing to a violin hanging against the wall, he continued, "Oblige me by playing an air of Mozart's." This request seemed to me so absurd that the idea involuntarily suggested itself to me that Selsam's brain was as crazy as my aunt's. But he guessed what I was thinking of, and observed with an ironical smile, "Don't be afraid, my dear Theodore, don't be afraid. My intellectual faculties are quite sound yet, but I am on the brink of a great and sublime discovery." "Good, then I am at your service." I took down the violin and looked at it with envious eyes. It was one of those famous Levenhaupts of which Frederick II caused a dozen to be made to accompany his flute performances. The most perfect instruments possible, faultless indeed, and by many good judges considered quite equal to those by Stradivarius. Be that as it may, I had hardly allowed the bow to touch the strings when all that had been said to me in its favor fell short of the reality. The extreme purity of its tones, added to the elegance of the composition, made me feel raised to the 7th heaven. "Oh, great, great master!" cried I. "Most sublime of melodists! Who could remain insensible to such grace, vigor, and inspiration?" My wig fell on the floor. My eyes twinkled. My knees shook. I was no longer master of myself. Selsam, the glass globe, and my aunt's illness had all passed out of my mind entirely. At last, in an hour's time, I woke up from a dream, and found myself lying on Dr. Adrian's sofa and trying to account for what had happened. I saw Selsam with a large magnifying glass in his hand, seated opposite the globe. The water it contained had become thick, and it was full of infusoria. "Well, Selsam," said I in a weak voice, "are you satisfied?" He came to my side with a look of delight on his face, and taking both my hands in his own, said with an expression of very great satisfaction on his face, "Thanks, my dear and worthy comrade. 1,000 thanks. You have just rendered science the greatest possible service." I was dumbfounded. "What? When I played that air from Mozart, was I rendering a service to science?
Yes, my dear friend Theodore, I cannot leave you in ignorance of the share you have had in solving the great problem. Come, follow me. You see everything and understand everything.
He lighted a lamp, for it had become dark. Then he opened a side door and made me a sign to follow him. I felt myself a prey to an emotion which I could not account. As we passed through several rooms, I fancied some great change was about to take place in my existence. Perhaps I was about to receive the key to the invisible world. The lamp threw a bright light on the gaudy furniture of the doctor's luxurious abode. Ornaments, pictures, and rich carpets disappeared one after the other into darkness, and the light, as it glided from one gilded picture to another, at last brought us to a staircase with bronze balusters. We descended into an inner court. The stealthy tone of our footsteps seemed at a distance like mysterious whisperings. When in the courtyard, I noticed the night was quiet. Numberless stars were shining in the sky. There were several doors before us. Selsam stopped at one and said, turning to me,
"This is my lecture hall, and here I dissect. Do not flurry yourself. Nature will only leave her secrets with the dead."
I was afraid, and I should have retreated had it been possible, but Adrian had entered the amphitheater without waiting my reply, and I felt obliged to follow him. So I went in, feeling very uneasy. And there, on a long oaken table, lay a body, the body of a young man, his hands close to his sides, head thrown back, eyes staring open, motionless as a clod of earth. He had a fine forehead. On the left side there was a wide wound exposing the cavity of the cheek. But it was the motionless silence which affected me more than the character of the head and the sight of the wound. Such is the man, thought I. Inertness, eternal rest. This overpowering idea was weighing me down, when Selsam, laying his scalpel's edge on the subject before him, said,
"This is all life. This will all be born again. Thousands of existences, enslaved by the same governing power, are about to regain their independence. The only part of this corpse which has ceased to exist in the power of commanding, and the authority which imposed one sole direction to all these individual lives, well, that power was there."
He struck the head, which returned a dull sound, as if he had touched a piece of wood. I was shaking. Nevertheless, Selsam's words reassured me somewhat. "It is not absolute annihilation, then?" said I. "So much the better. I would rather live in detail than not live at all."
"Yes,"
observed Selsam, who seemed to read my thoughts on my face as fast as my mind conceived them.
"Yes, man in detail is immortal. Every one of the atoms which compose him are immortal and imperishable. They all live, suffer, think, but their life, their sufferings, their thoughts are transmitted to the soul which rules them, provides for their wants, and imposes its will upon them. Men have sought for a type of the most perfect form of government, and pretended to have discovered it in a hive of bees or a nest of ants. This ideal model of a government, here it is."
With these words he plunged his scalpel into the subject and opened it completely. I stared back, horror-struck, but he took no notice of me and calmly continued.
"Now let us first observe the means of the soul's action and transmission. You see, there are thousands of white threads which extend and spread all through the body. They are the nerves, the high roads of this great country, whence come and go messengers quicker than the lightning, carrying the orders of the central atoms to the extremities, or warning it of the dangers and wants which affect its innumerable subjects. Thus everything proceeds, moves, and directs itself to the aim assigned to it by the soul. Still, every atom has its own peculiar task. For instance, see here, Theodore, are the organs of respiration. Here, those of the circulation of the blood, the heart, the veins, and the arteries. Here are the digestive organs, the stomach, and the intestines. Now, you must not believe for a moment that they are all composed of the same elements, the same beings. No, when decomposition sets in, the lungs produce one species of insects, the intestines another, and the heart again a totally different species, and so on with every organ. Man, when living, is an entire universe subjected to one will, and you must know that again every one of these infinitesimal atoms possesses a soul in itself. The Supreme Being has granted no privileged immortality, For all and everything, from the very smallest atom to the immeasurable whole occupying space, are subjected to the same invariable justice. Nothing is absent from the place which its merit has assigned it, which alone explains the admirable order which regulates the world, so that man, a fragment of humanity, is compelled to obey God, just as the atoms act according to the will of the living man. Just form an idea, Theodore, of the infinite power of that great being whose will acts upon us as our soul acts upon our flesh and blood. All nature is the flesh and blood of God. Through it he suffers, thinks, and acts. Each of its atoms is imperishable, for God cannot perish in one of his atoms.
"Where, then, is my liberty of action?" I exclaimed. "If I am but an enslaved atom, how can I be responsible for my actions?"
"Liberty is not affected," said Selsam, "for the atom of my flesh may revolt against my entire being, as is frequently the case, but then it perishes, and my organization removes it. It has been free, and it but undergoes the consequences of its own actions. So am I free to act. I can rise and revolt against God's laws. I may abuse the power I possess over the beings of which I am composed, and thus induce my own dissolution. The atoms then become independent, and my soul loses its power. Is it not sufficient to prove that we suffer the consequences of our own faults to show that we are responsible, and consequently free?" To all this I was without a reply ready, and we stood there staring at one another. "All this, my dear Selsam," said I at last, "may be very logical, and your theories may be superb, but I do not see the connection between them and your water bottle, and what my aunt's complaints have to do with the air of Mozart." "Nothing is plainer," replied he, smiling. "You are of course aware that the vibration of sound can impart a rapid motion to grains of sand spread over a drumhead, and cause it to describe geometrical figures of very marvelous regularity." "Of course, but, said he impatiently, "let me finish my explanation. In the same way as sounds act upon fluid atoms, whence infinite combinations result, with this difference, that these atoms being in motion, the forms which result from them are animated creatures. This is what naturalists call equivocal creation. Now sound, acting on the nervous system, produces a disengagement of electricity, which acts in its turn on the liquids contained in our bodies, when thousands and thousands of insects are produced, which attack our organs and cause several diseases, such as deafness, epilepsy, singing in the ears, dimness of sight, catalepsy, idiocy, nightmare, convulsions, St. Vitus's dance, spasms, and many other complaints to which women who are fond of music are particularly subject, and the nature of which has remained unknown to this day. All these insects spread themselves through the tissues of our bodies as if they were so many worm-eaten pieces of furniture. They soon take entire possession of us and dismantle us entirely. It is the history of the Roman people, innovated by Asiatic luxury. The barbarians made short work of them when they attacked them." This description of Selsam's made my hair stand on end. "And do you believe," I asked, "that music is the cause of this disastrous state of things?" "Indubitably it is. Only look at the old organ players in the streets, or those who practice much on the harp and the piano in our homes, to be convinced of it. The health of your unfortunate aunt is threatened most seriously. I only know one way to prevent the entire loss of her reason, if not her life." "What way, Selsam? Although I am her heir presumptive, it is a question of conscience with me to do my best to save her." "Yes," he replied, "I know your delicacy of feeling. It is affection, and not interest, which makes you speak as you do. But it is late, Theodore. I heard the clock strike 12 but now. Return here tomorrow evening at 10, and I shall have by that time prepared the only remedy which can save your Aunt Anna. I wish you to owe her restoration to health entirely to me. The cure will be a radical one. I give you my word. As professor, it shall be so." "I am sure it will, but could you not just tell me?" "What would be the use of telling you now? Tomorrow you shall know all. I must sleep now." He crossed the court. He opened the door into the Bergstrasse for me. We shook hands as we wished each other good night,
and I regained my chamber, but with reflections of no very agreeable nature. 2. All that night I was unable to close my eyes. I passed the time I ought to have devoted to sleep in trying to conjecture how Selsam would drive the formidable array of parasites which he had described in the last chapter from the body of my respected Aunt Wunderlich. This idea haunted me the whole of the next day until the evening. I went in and out, and talked out loud to myself so that people turned round to look at me as I passed by, so great was my preoccupation. As I passed the shop of Quarnham, the chemist I stopped for more than an hour to read the numerous labels on the phials in large bottles at his window. Asphodida, arsenic, chloroline, potassium, friar's balsam, the Capuchin's remedy, Mademoiselle Stephen's remedy, de Fioravanti's, etc., etc. Good heavens, said I to myself, one must be lucky indeed to hit upon the exact remedy to cure one without destroying the central atom. It must require some courage to dose oneself with asafoetida, or the Capuchin's or Fioravanti's remedy, when sometimes merely a bit of bread or a morsel of meat suffices to give one a fit of indigestion. That same evening, while sitting at supper with my good aunt, I looked at her with compassion. Alas, poor Aunt Wunderlich, thought I, if you knew that thousands of ferocious, though microscopically small insects are working your destruction while you sit there quietly drinking tea. "Why do you look at me in that way, Theodore?" she asked uneasily. "Oh, nothing, Aunt, nothing." "Yes, it is something. I see you think I am looking ill this evening. Is it not so?" "Well, you are looking pale. I would make a bet you have some fresh music lately." "So I have. Yesterday the music of the opera of the Grand Doris was sent me. A most sublime composition, quite a—" "I was sure of it. And you have passed the evening in practicing on the piano, throwing yourself into attitudes and being enraptured and gasping out, 'Ah, divine, perfect, marvelous,' every moment." She became purple. "What is the meaning of all this? Do you mean to say, sir, that I have not the right to—" "I never said anything of the sort, but you're ruining your nervous system in doing so. You—" "My nervous system? You must be going mad. You don't know what you say." "In heaven's name, calm yourself, Aunt. Anger disengages electricity, which in its turn produces thousands of insects." "Insects?" cried she, jumping up from her chair. "Insects? Have you ever seen any insects about me, you wretch? What? You dare to come here? It is infamous. Insects! Louise! Kettle! Leave the room, sir!" "But, Aunt—" "Leave the room this moment! I disinherit you this instant!" She screamed and cried. Her cap fell over one side of her face. She looked horrible. "Look here, Aunt," said I, as I rose to go away. "Don't be angry. I did not mean the insects you fancy I did. I speak of thysanomes and coleopters and lepidopters and these myriads of little monsters which have effected a lodgment in your body and are daily devouring you." At these words, Aunt Wunderlich fell back in her armchair, her arms hanging down, and her face so pale that the rouge which she habitually applied to her cheeks looked like large spots of blood. I made but one bound from our house to Selsam's apartment. When I entered his room, I was, as I heard afterwards, as pale as death. "My friend, she has had an attack." Then I stopped, struck with amazement. There was a number of persons present. In the first place, the conservator of the Archaeological Museum, Daniel Bremer, with his powdered wig and maroon-colored coat, his fat face and projecting eyes like a frog's. He was holding a sort of gigantic bagpipe to his mouth, and seemed to be explaining how to play it. Then the chapel-master, Christian Hofer, buried in an armchair with his long legs hidden away under the table. He was engaged in playing the keys of another strange-looking instrument like a long tube with his bony fingers, and never raised his eyes to look at me as I opened the door, so absorbed was he in examining the instrument he held. Then there was Caspar Marbach, prosector at St. Catherine's Hospital, and Rebstock, dean of the faculty of Belles Lettres, both in black coats and white cravats, the one armed with an immense bronze plate, the other begirt with a drum made of some foreign wood covered with goatskin. These serious-looking persons were seated round the lamp, their cheeks puffed out. Their attentive demeanor seemed to me so grotesque that I stood nailed where I was, with outstretched neck and open mouth, as if I were in a dream. Selsam gravely offered me a chair, and the conservator of the museum continued his explanations. "This gentleman is the famous Buscatibia,
of the Swiss. It is capable of emitting most terrible sounds which are audible above the torrent's roar. If the Councillor Theodore will have the goodness to take it, I am convinced he will produce some very great effects from it." He put the horn into my hands with an air of great solemnity, then addressed himself to the prosector, Caspar Marbeck. "Your drum, sir, is the finest of the sort we have ever seen. It is the carabo of the Egyptians and the Assyrians. The jugglers of the East make use of it for their snakes and bayadères to dance to." "Thus?" asked the prosector, striking the drum alternately with either hand. "Right. Quite right. Very well. Now for the Dean. He has only to strike his bronze plate every second. It is the famous tam-tam, and its dismal tones resemble the knell of our cathedral's great bell. It will produce a marvelous effect, especially in the silence of the night. Do you all understand your parts, gentlemen?" "Quite well." "Then we may as well set out." "One moment," said the doctor. "I ought to make Theodore understand what decision we have come to." Then addressing himself to me, "My dear friend, your respected aunt's situation requires a very strong remedy. After many hours' reflection, a brilliant idea has occurred to me. What is her complaint? It is a nausea of the nervous system. It is a debility arising from the abuse of music. Well, under such circumstances, what is to be done? What course of treatment pursued? The most rational one is that of Hippocrates, founded on the dogma contraria contrariis curantur, and that of our immortal Hoffmann, similia similibus curantur. What is there more opposed to the tame and insipid music of our sentimental operas than the wild and savage music of the Hebrews, the Caribs, and the Abyssinians? Nothing. I borrow then their instruments, and I execute some Hottentot airs in the presence of your respected aunt, and the principle contraria contrariis is followed out by my treatment. Again, what resembles music more than music itself? Clearly nothing. Hahnemann's principle, similia similibus, is equally respected, and at the same time—" This seemed to me a most sublime idea. "Selsam!" I exclaimed. "You are indeed a genius. Hippocrates has summed up the thesis of medicine, and Hahnemann the antithesis. But you have just created the synthesis, and a great discovery it is." I know it," said he. "But allow me to conclude. I consequently had recourse to the conservator of the Museum of Voyages and Travels, who not only consented to lend us the tam-tam, the buscatibia, and the carabo from his collection, but willingly proffered us his assistance to play the fife, which will complete our improvised concert in the most harmonious manner." I made the conservator a very low bow expressive of my gratitude. He seemed touched by it, and said to me, "Believe me, Consul Killian, I am most happy to be able to render you the smallest service, or your respected Aunt Dame Anna Wunderlich, whose many virtues are clouded momentarily by this unhappy exaggeration of musical enjoyment, and the abuse of the use of stringed instruments. Let us thus trust our efforts may succeed in bringing her back to the simpler tastes of our forefathers." "Let us hope we may," I exclaimed. "Now, gentlemen, we must go," said Selsam. Then we all descended the grand staircase. It was just striking 11. The night was dark, not a star to be seen, but gusts of wind made the weathercocks creak and the street lamps swing backwards and forwards. We glided along the walls like so many malefactors, each carrying his instrument concealed under his coat. When we reached my aunt's door, I gently inserted the key in the door, and Selsam having lighted a wax taper, we entered the hall in silence. Then each of us took his place opposite the chamber door, and with his instrument at his lips only awaited the signal to begin. This had all been done in such extreme quiet that not a soul had stirred in the house. Selsam even gently pushed the door ajar, and then raising his voice called out, "Now!" I did indeed blow my bullock's horn, and the tam-tam, the fife, and the carabo all began at the same time. It is not possible to convey any idea of this barbarous serenade. One would have thought the roof of the house was about to fall in. We heard one cry, but instead of leaving off, a sort of frenzy took possession of us, and the big drum and the rest made such an infernal din that I could no longer hear the sounds which proceeded from the horn on which I was playing. The dismal sounds of the tam-tam inspired us with an inexpressible feeling of terror, such as one might feel at a feast of cannibals, at which one would probably play the part of the roast joint. Our hair stood upright on our heads. The trumpet at the Day of Judgment sounding the reveille for the dead could not have produced a more terrible effect. 20 times did Selsam endeavor to stop us, but we were deaf to his cries.
and a sort of diabolical frenzy seemed to have possessed us. At last fatigue and a want of breath put an end to this horrible din. Then Selsam, raising his finger, said, "Silence! Listen!" But our ears were for the moment completely deafened, and we could hear nothing. After a few minutes' pause, the doctor, becoming uneasy, pushed the door open and advanced into the room to see the result of his remedy. We awaited his return impatiently. As he seemed a long time absent, I was about to follow him when he came out looking very pale and looked very strangely at us all. "Gentlemen," said he, "let us go." "But, Selsam, what was the result of your experiment?" I was holding him by the arm. He turned brusquely around and said, "Well, she is dead." "Dead?" cried I, starting back. "Yes, the electric disengagement was too violent. It has destroyed all the internal parasites, but it has at the same time shattered the central atom. But all the same, that proves nothing against my discovery. On the contrary, your aunt died, it is true, but cured." And then he walked off. We followed, pale and frightened. As soon as we got into the street, we separated, some one way, some another, without exchanging a word. The denouement had alarmed us. The next day the whole town learned that Dame Anna Wunderlich had died suddenly. Some of her neighbors asserted that they had heard very strange noises the preceding night, but as there had been a great storm about the same time, the police made no inquiries about it. Besides, the doctor who had been called in declared that my aunt had died from an attack of apoplexy while playing the final duet in the Grand Darius, for which she was found dead, seated in her armchair before the piano, with the opera open before her. So everything went off well, and we were not troubled in any way. About 6 months after this occurrence, Dr. Selsam published a work on the treatment of helminths, or internal parasites, by the aid of music. A work which had very great success. Prince Hatto von Schlittenhoff sent him the Grand Cross of the Black Vulture, and Her Highness, the reigning Duchess, condescended to congratulate him in person. It is even now a question whether he shall not be named president of the Scientific Society in the place of old Matthias Kobus. In fact, he is a very lucky man. As for myself, I shall reproach myself all my life for having contributed to the death of my dear Aunt Anna Wunderlich by blowing that abominable busca tibia for a quarter of an hour. True, it is I had no idea of harming her, but on the contrary, I hoped by doing so to enable her to get rid of her internal insects, and so lengthen her life for many years. Nevertheless, dead she is, poor woman, and grieved I am on her account. I call God to witness that the idea of destroying the central atom never once occurred to me. Indeed, I am ashamed to confess I should have laughed at anyone who would have come and told me that by means of an air of music we could kill even a little fly. End of Section 1. Section 2 of Stories of the Rhine by Erckmann-Chatrian. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. The Miraculous Draught of Fishes. 1. One morning in the month of September 1850, old Andreas Kappelmans, the marine painter, my worthy master, and I were quietly smoking our pipes at the window of his studio, on the upper floor of the old house which forms the right-hand corner of the Rue des Brabacons on the bridge of Leyden, while we emptied a pot of ale to our respective healths. I was then 18 years of age, with a pink and white face and fair hair. Kappelmans was about 50. His large nose was becoming rather blue. His hair was silvery at the temples, wrinkles were forming round his little gray eyes, and deeper ones traversed his brown cheeks. Instead of the cock's plume, which it was once his pride to wear, he now carried but a single feather from a raven's wing in his hat. The weather was very fine. Before us the old Rhine flowed along. A few white clouds were floating in the blue sky. The port and its great black barges, with their sails motionless, seemed asleep at our feet. The blue waves reflected the rays of the sun, and hundreds of swallows were cleaving the air in all directions. There we sat, musing, much disposed to sentimental reflections. The large vine leaves which grew round our window quivered at every breath of air. A butterfly fluttered by, and a dozen chirping sparrows immediately set off in pursuit. Down below, on the roof of a shed, a great tortoise-shell cat sat blinking in the sun, and waving gently its tail from side to side, in a mood as meditative as our own. It was the most tranquilizing sight imaginable. Nevertheless, Kappelmann's seemed sad and anxious. "Master Andreas," said I suddenly, "you seem very much out of sorts." "You're right," replied he. "I am as melancholy as a cudgelled donkey." "Why? We have plenty of work. You have more orders than you can execute, and we shall have the kermesse here in a fortnight." "I have had a bad dream." "Master Kappelmann's, do you believe in dreams?" "I am not sure, Christian, whether it was a dream or not, for I had my eyes wide open." Then, knocking the ashes out of his pipe on the window-sill, "You must have heard," said he, "of my old comrade Van Marius, the famous marine painter who understood the sea as well as Ruysdael did the land, Van Ostade a village, Rembrandt dark interior effects, and Rubens temples, palaces, and feasts. He was indeed a great painter. When one looked at his picture, one did not say, 'How well painted,' but 'How beautiful the sea looks,' or 'How grand, how terrible it is.' You could not see the brush of Van Marius at work. It seemed like the shadow of God's hand on the canvas. Oh, genius, genius, what a sublime gift that is, Christian!" Kappelmann's was silent, his lips were closed, his brows contracted, and he had tears in his eyes. It was the first time I had ever seen him in this mood, so I was quite astonished. In another moment he continued. "Van Marius and I had studied together at Utrecht under old Rhine. We were in love with two sisters. We used to pass our evenings together at the sign of the Frog like two brothers. We afterwards came to Leyden, arm in arm. Van Marius had but one fault. He liked Geneva and Schiedam better than ale and porter. You must do me the justice to admit, Christian, that I never get intoxicated with anything but ale, and for that reason I am always in good health. Unfortunately, Van Marius used to get drunk on Geneva. Even then, if he had only drunk when he was at the tavern, but he used to have liquor sent to his studio. He could only work with energy when he had a couple of pints of spirits under his belt, and his eyes were coming out of his head. Then you should see him and hear him yell and sing and whistle. He would roar like the sea as he worked. Every touch of his brush raised a wave. At every whistle you could see the clouds getting larger and heavier and darker. Then he would snatch up a brush with red, and lo, the lightning flowed from the sky down on the dark waves like a stream of melted lead, while in the distance was a vessel, a cutter maybe, a dismantled wreck, amidst the darkness and the white foam of the waves. It was frightful. When Van Marius painted a calm, he made the old blind man, Cabalist, play the clarionet to him for 2 florins a day. He mixed his Geneva with ale and ate sausages to inspire his imagination with scenes of country life. You must see yourself, Christian, how destructive such a regime as that must have been to the talent of any man. How many times did I say to him, 'Take care, Jan, take care, Geneva will be the death of you some day.' But instead of listening to me, he would begin to thunder out some drinking song, and he always ended by crowing like a cock. This was his greatest pleasure. For instance, at the tavern, when his glass was empty, instead of knocking the bottom against the table to call the waiter's attention to him, he would shake his arms and begin crowing until his wants were attended to. For some time past, Marius had often spoken to me about his chef d'oeuvre, the miraculous draught of fishes. He had shown me his first sketches for it, and I was delighted with them, when one morning he suddenly disappeared from Leyden, and since then no one has heard anything of him." Here Kappelmann thoughtfully lighted his pipe again and continued. "Last night I was at the Golden Jug with Dr. Romer of Eisenlafel and 5 or 6 comrades. About 10, apropos to what I cannot say, Romer began declaiming against potatoes, declaring they were the scourge of the human race, that since the discovery of potatoes the aborigines of America, the Irish, the Swedes, the Dutch, and generally speaking, all those nations which consume great quantities of spirituous liquors, instead of taking their former position in the world, were now reduced to nothing. He attributed this decay to potato brandy, and while I was listening to him, I cannot tell by what chain of reasoning it came into my head, the memory of Van Marius presented itself to me. Poor old fellow, thought I, what is he doing now? Has he finished his great picture? Why have I never heard from him? While thinking over these things, Zelig, the watchman, came into the tavern to tell us it was time to go.
It was striking 11. I went straight home. My head felt rather heavy, and I went to sleep. About an hour afterwards, Brigitte, the stocking-mender opposite, set fire to her curtains. She screamed out, "Fire!" I heard a noise of people running in the street. I opened my eyes, and what do I see? A great black cock perched on the easel in the middle of the room. In less than half a minute, the old woman's curtains had blazed away and burned themselves out. Everyone went home again laughing, but the black cock remained there on his perch. And as the moon shone brightly between the towers of the town hall, this singular animal was perfectly visible to me. He had large yellow eyes, with a red circle round them, and scratched his comb with his claw. I'd been watching him for at least 10 minutes, trying to explain to myself how this strange creature could have found its way into my studio, when it left off scratching its comb, raised its head, and said, "What, Capelmans? You don't recognize me? I am nevertheless the soul of your friend Van Marius." "The soul of Van Marius?" cried I. "Is Van Marius dead, then?"
"Yes," replied the cock with a melancholy air. "It is all over, my poor friend. I wanted to have a trial of strength with Herod von Gombrinius. We drank 2 days and 2 nights without stopping. This morning of the 3rd day, as old Judith was extinguishing the candles, I rolled under the table. My body now rests in Osterhafen Cemetery, facing the sea, and I am looking out for some new organism. But that is not the question now. I came to ask a service of you, Capelmans."
"A service? Say, what is it?" "All that man can do will I do for you."
"Very good," replied the cock. "Very good. I was sure you would not refuse my request. Well, this is how the matter stands. You must know, Andreas, that I had gone to the Herring Creek on purpose to finish the miraculous draught of fishes. Unfortunately, the death surprised me before I could put the last touches to this picture. Gambrinus has hung it as a trophy in the great room of his tavern, and that fills my soul with bitterness. I shall only be at rest when it is finished, and I come now to pray to you to finish it for me. You promise me you will. Is it not so, Capelmans?"
"Rest assured, John, it shall be done."
"Then good night."
Whereupon the cock flapped his wings and flew through one of the panes of glass without making the least noise. Having concluded this extraordinary story, Capelmans laid his pipe down in the window and finished his glass at a gulp. We sat for some time in silence, looking at one another. "And do you believe that this black cock was the soul of Van Marius?" said I at last to the good master.
"Do I believe it? I feel sure it was."
"Then what do you intend to do, Master Andreas?"
"It is very clear what I have to do. I shall go to Osterhafen. An honest man must keep his promise, and I have given mine to Van Marius to finish his picture for him, and I will finish it, cost what it may. In an hour, Van Eyck, the one-eyed man, will be here with his cart for me."
Then he ceased speaking and looked earnestly at me.
"Now I think of it," said he, "you had better come with me, Christian. It is a good opportunity for you to see the Herring Creek. Besides, who knows what may happen? I should well be satisfied to have you with me."
"I should like to go very much, Master Andres," said I, "but you know what my Aunt Catherine is, as well as I can tell you. She will never let me go."
"Your Aunt Catherine! I shall tell her it is indispensable for your improvement that you should see the coast. How can a man become a painter of marine subjects who has never quitted the neighborhood of Leyden, and all he knows of the sea is the insignificant port of Kalwick? That is all nonsense. You must come with me, Christian. That is a settled thing."
While the good man was talking, he put on his loose jacket, and then taking me by the arm, he gravely took me to my aunt. I need not repeat to you all that was said on both sides, my aunt's objections, and how they were met by Master Capelmans, in order to induce her to allow me to go with him. The fact is, he ended by having his own way, and 2 hours after we were rolling along in the carts towards Osterhafen. 2. Our cart, drawn by a Zuiderzee pony with a big head, short and hairy legs, and his back covered with an old dogskin rug, had been rolling along for 3 hours between Leyden and Herring Creek, without appearing to be any nearer the end of our journey. The setting sun shed its long purple rays across the marshy plain. The ditches were flaming red, and all round the reeds, rushes, and shave grass which grew on their banks threw their black shadows across the dike. It soon grew dark, and Capelmans, rousing himself from his meditations, called out, "Wrap yourself up well in your cloak, Christian. Pull your fur cap over your ears, and keep your feet well covered with straw. Hop, Barabbas, hop! We are crawling along like snails." At
the same time, he had recourse to his stone bottle of Schiedam, and then, wiping his lips with the back of his hand, he offered it to me with the remark, "Take a pull at it, Christian, to keep the fog out of your stomach. It is a sea fog, the very worst of all fogs." I thought it right to take Kappelmann's advice, and the goodness of the liquor put me in a good humor directly. "My dear Christian," said my old master after a few moments' silence, "as we shall have to pass 5 or 6 hours in this fog with nothing to help us to pass the time but smoking our pipes and listening to the creaking of the cart, let us talk about Osterhofen." Then the good man began to give me a description of the tavern called the Jar of Tobacco, the house the best supplied with beer and spirits of any in Holland. "It is situated in the lane of the Trois Sabots," said he. "It is easily recognized a long way off by its large flat roof and small square windows overlooking the port. A great chestnut tree stands opposite. On the right there is a skittle alley running along an old moss-covered wall, and behind is the poultry yard with hundreds of ducks, geese, fowls, and turkeys, the screaming, cackling, and quacking of which only cease at night. There is nothing very extraordinary in the great room of the tavern, but there, under the dark rafters of the ceiling and clouds of blue smoke, at a counter made in the shape of a cask, sits enthroned the dreaded Herod van Gambrinus, surnamed the Bacchus of the North. This man can drink at a sitting 2 gallons of porter. Trebelex, ale, and lambic go down his throat as easily as down a tin funnel. It is only Geneva which he acknowledges as a master. Woe be to the painter who sets foot in this pandemonium! I tell you, Christian, he had better never have been born. Good-looking young serving girls, with long yellow curls, are forward in offering their services, and Gambrinus holds out his large hairy hand, but it is but luring him to his soul's destruction. The victim leaves the tavern as the companions of Ulysses quitted the cavern of Circe." After talking very gravely in this strain for some time, Kappelmann's lighted his pipe and began to smoke in silence. I had become very melancholy. An overpowering feeling of sadness took possession of me. It seemed I was getting every instant nearer an impassable gulf, and had it been possible I would have jumped out of the cart, and, God forgive me, I would have left my old master to prosecute his enterprise of danger alone. The only thing perhaps which prevented my doing so was the impossibility of crossing those unknown marshes in the darkness of night. So I was obliged to follow the course of events, even if I suffered the fatal consequences which I anticipated. About 10, Master Andreas fell asleep, his head dropped on my shoulder. I kept awake an hour longer, and then fatigue sent me, in my turn, to sleep. I know not how long this state of rest lasted, but the cart stopped with a jolt, and the driver called out, "Here we are!" Kappelmann's uttered an exclamation of surprise, while a cold shiver ran all over me from my head to my feet. If I lived 100 years, the Jar of Tobacco, such as I then saw it for the first time, with its little windows blazing with light, and its large roof reaching nearly to the ground, will always be present to my recollection. It was a very dark night. The sea was roaring about 100 yards behind us, and I could hear the droning of bagpipes above the clamor of the waves. In the darkness I could see the grotesque outlines of the dancers on the glass of the windows. It was quite the effect of a magic lantern. The dirty lane lighted up by a horn lantern, the strange faces appearing and disappearing again into the darkness like rats in a drain. The uninterrupted drone of the bagpipes, the pony belonging to Van Eyck standing with his feet in the mud, Kappelmann's wrapping his cloak still closer round him, and the moon half obscured by clouds, all contributed to confirm my apprehensions, and made me feel sadder than ever. We were about to leave the cart when from out of the darkness a tall man suddenly advanced. He wore a large flapped hat, a pointed beard, turned-down collar on a velvet pourpoint, and a threefold gold chain round his neck after the fashion of the ancient Flemish painters. "Is it you, Kappelmans?" said this man, whose sharp profile was distinctly visible against the windows of the den before us. "Yes, master," replied Andreas, quite stupefied. "Take care," said the unknown, raising his finger. "Beware, the Slayer of Souls is waiting for you." "Rest assured, Andreas Kappelmans will do his duty." "That is well. You are a man of your word. The spirit of the old masters is on your side." As he spoke, the stranger disappeared in the darkness, and Kappelmans, pale but resolute, got down from the cart. I followed him, but I cannot describe in what a state of mind I was. After this short dialogue, we went up the dark passage, and Master Andreas, who was leading the way, soon turned round to me and said, "Pay attention, Christian." He at the same time gave the door a push, and under hams, herrings, and strings of black puddings hanging from the black rafters of the ceiling, I could see about 100 men sitting in rows at long tables, some crouching like monkeys, with their shoulders up to their ears, others with their legs stretched out before them, their fur caps over their ears and their backs against the wall, puffing forth volumes of smoke, which eddied along the room. They all seemed to be laughing, with their eyes half closed, their cheeks wrinkled to their ears, and appeared to be plunged in a state of drunken contentment. On the right, a blazing fire sent gleams of light from one end of the room to the other, and here old Judith, who was as long and as thin as a broomstick, and her face purple with heat, was holding a frying pan over the fire, in which she was preparing supper for some of the customers. But what astonished me most of all was Herod Gambrinus himself, seated at his counter, a little to the left, just as Master Andreas had described him, his shirt sleeves tucked up on his hairy arms, his elbows leaning on the board surrounded by shining pots, and his cheeks resting on his enormous fists, his thick red wig all in disorder, and his long yellow beard flowing over his chest. He was looking earnestly at the picture of the Miraculous Draught, which was hanging up at one end of the room, just above the little wooden clock. I had been watching him for some seconds, when outside the watchman's horn was audible close to the lane of the Trois Sabbats, and at the same moment old Judith, giving her frying pan a toss, began to say with a sneer,
"Midnight! The great painter Van Marius has been lying for 12 days in Osterhofen Cemetery, and the Avenger comes not."
"He is here," said Kappelmans, stepping forward into the room. All eyes were fixed upon him, and Gambrinus, turning his head toward him, smiled, and began caressing his beard.
"Is that you, Kappelmans?" said he in a jeering tone. "I have been expecting you. So you have come to fetch away the miraculous draught of fishes."
"Yes," replied Master Andreas. "I have promised Van Marius to finish his chef d'oeuvre, and finish it I will."
"You will? You will have it?" returned the other. "Comrade, that is easier said than done. Do you know that I won it, tankard in hand?"
"I know it, and I intend to win it back, tankard in hand, as you did."
"Then you are determined to play the great game?"
"Yes, determined. May the God of justice be on my side. I will keep my word, or I roll under the table a vanquished man." The eyes of Gambrinus glittered.
"You have heard him," cried he, addressing himself to the topers around him. "It is he who challenges me. Let it be as he desires."
Then turning to Master Andreas,
"Who is your umpire?"
"My umpire is Christian Rebstock," said Kappelmans, motioning to me to come forward. I was in a terrific fright. Then one of the spectators, Ignace van de Broek, burgomaster of Osterhofen, wearing a great flaxen wig, drew a paper from his pocket and read as follows like a schoolmaster. "The drinker's umpire has of right a white cloth, a clean glass, and a white candle. Let him be supplied." And a tall red-haired girl put those articles by my side. "Who is your umpire?" asked Master Andreas.
"Adam Van Rassimus."
This Adam Van Rassimus, with a pimpled nose, a villainous stoop, and a black eye, came and seated himself by me. He was supplied with the same articles by the same handmaid. Then Herod, holding out his great hand across the counter to his adversary, called out,
"You have recourse neither to charms nor witchcraft."
"Neither charms nor witchcraft," replied Chappelmans.
"Are without hatred towards me?"
"When I have avenged Fritz Coppelius, Tobias Vogel, the landscape painter, Romer, Nickelbrauer, Dietrich Winkelmann, Van Marius, all painters of reputation, and drowned by you in ale and porter, and then plundered of their labors by you, then I shall feel no hatred towards you." Herod burst into a loud laugh, and stretching out his arms till his powerful shoulders touched the wall behind him, he exclaimed,
"I vanquished them, tankard in hand, honorably and loyally, as I am about to vanquish you. Their works have become my rightful property, and as is your hatred, I laugh at it and despise it. Drink."
Then my dear friends began to struggle the like of which has never been known in Holland within the memory of man, and which will be talked of for ages to come if it pleases God. Black and white had met in arms. The destiny of one was about to be accomplished. A cask of ale was placed on the table, and 2 pots containing a pint each were filled to the brim. Herod and Master Andreas drank them off at once, and so on every half hour with the regularity of a clock until the cask was empty. Then they passed on to porter, and after porter to lambic. I could easily tell you how many barrels of strong beer were emptied in this memorable battle. The burgomaster Van de Broek noted down the exact quantity in the parish register of Osterhofen for the information of future drinkers, but you would refuse to believe me. It would seem so incredible. Let it suffice to tell you that the struggle lasted 3 days and 3 nights. The like had never been seen. It was the first time Herod had found himself in presence of an adversary capable of resisting him. The news, therefore, soon spread abroad. All the world on foot, on horseback, and in carts hurried to the tavern. It was quite a procession. And as no one seemed inclined to leave before the termination of the struggle, it happened consequently that the second day the tavern was crammed with visitors. One could hardly move about, and the burgomaster was obliged to tap the table with his cane and call out, "Room! Room!" to allow the cellarmen to carry the cask to the table on their shoulders. All this time Master Andreas and Gambrinus continued swallowing their pints with marvelous regularity. Sometimes, as I added up in my mind the number of quarts they had drunk, I thought I must be dreaming, and I would look uneasily at Capelmans, but he would wink his eye and say with a smile, "Well, Christian, we are getting on. Have a glass, it will do you good." Then I was quite confounded. The soul of von Marius possesses him surely, I thought. It must be that which keeps him up. As for Gambrinus, with his little boxwood pipe between his lips, his elbow on the counter, and his cheek resting on his hand, he sat smoking his pipe like a respectable old shopkeeper taking his glass of beer while he thought over the affairs of the day. It was inconceivable. The oldest drinkers themselves had never seen anything like it. The morning of the 3rd day, before the lights were extinguished, seeing the struggle threatened to be prolonged indefinitely, the burgomeister told Judith to bring a needle and thread for the first test. Then there was great excitement, and everyone came nearer to see how it would be. According to the rules of the great game, the combatant who comes victorious from this ordeal has a right to choose what liquor he prefers for the rest of the battle. Herod had laid his pipe down on the counter. He took the needle and thread which Van de Broek offered him, and raising his huge body, with his eyes coming out of his head, he lifted his arm and applied the thread to the eye of the needle. But whether his hand was too heavy or the light of the candles dazzled his sight, he was obliged to make 2 attempts which had a great effect on all the spectators, for they looked at one another quite bewildered. "It is your turn, Capelmans," said the burgomaster. Then Master Andreas rose, took the needle, and at the first attempt, threaded it. Frantic applause shook the room. I expected to see the whole building come down about our ears. I looked at Gambrinus. His great fleshy face was puffed up with blood, his cheeks shook. At the expiration of 1 minute, after silence had been obtained, Van de Broek struck 3 blows on the table, and then gravely asked, "Master Capelmans, your glory in Bacchus is great. What drink do you choose?" "Schiedam," replied Master Andreas. "Old Schiedam, the oldest and the strongest." These words produced a surprising effect on the tavern-keeper. "No," cried he. "No! Beer if you will, always beer. No Schiedam." He got on his legs and looked frightfully pale. "I regret," said the burgomeister briefly, "that the regulations are formal. Let Capelmans have what he chooses." Then Gambrinus reseated himself like a criminal who hears his sentence of death, and they brought us some Schiedam of the year 22, which Van Rassimus and I tasted to guard against any deception or adulteration. The glasses were filled, and the struggle recommenced. The whole population of Osterhofen was thronging about the house and staring in at the windows. The lights had been extinguished, and it was broad daylight. As the contest approached its denouement, the bystanders became more and more silent. All the customers were standing on chairs, on tables, and on empty barrels watching attentively. Capelmans had called for a black pudding, and was eating it with a good appetite, but Gambrinus was no longer the same man. The scheedam had stupefied him. His great crimson face was covered with perspiration. His ears were violet, his eyelids dropped. Sometimes a nervous shudder made him raise his head. And then with staring eyes and dropping lip he gazed at the sea of silent faces crowded together before him. And then he took his glass in both hands and drank while his throat rattled. In all my life I never saw anything more horrible. Everyone saw that the tavern-keeper's defeat was certain. "He is a lost man," said they. "He thought himself invincible, but he has met his master. Another glass or two, and it is all over with him." But there were some who thought otherwise. They declared that Herod might hold out 3 or 4 hours longer, and Van Rossimus offered to bet a cask of ale that he would not roll under the table before sundown. But a circumstance, trifling in itself, occurred which hastened the catastrophe. It was nearly midday. Nickel Spitz, the cellarman, had filled the jugs for the 4th time. Old Judith, after having attempted in vain to put water to the scheedam, had just left the room drowned in tears, and we could hear her crying and lamenting in the next room. Herod was dozing. All at once the old clock began to grate and creak in a strange fashion. It struck 12 amidst a general silence, and the little wooden cock perched above the dial flapped his wings and began to crow. Then, my dear friends, those who were in the room were spectators of a frightful scene. When the cock began to crow, the tavern-keeper raised himself to his full height, as if acted upon by an invisible spring. I shall never forget that half-open mouth, those haggard eyes, and that face livid with fright. I can see him now stretching out his hands to drive some horrible image away. I can hear him now screaming as if he was being strangled. "That cock! Oh, that cock!" He tried to move, but his legs bent under him, and the terrible Herod von Gambrinus fell like an ox struck down by the butcher at the feet of Master Andreas Kappelmans. The next day, about 6 in the morning, Kappelmans and I quitted Osterhofen, carrying with us the picture of the miraculous draught of fishes. Our return to Leyden was quite a triumph. The whole town, having heard of Master Andreas's victory, came out to meet us in the streets. It was like a Sunday in fair time, but it seemed to have no effect on Kappelmans. He had not opened his mouth the whole journey home, and seemed very much preoccupied. As soon as he reached his house, his first order was that he was at home to no one. "Christian," said the good man to me as he took off his great cloak, "I want to be alone. Go home to your aunt and try to work. When the picture is finished, I will send Cobus to tell you." He embraced me and pushed me gently into the street. One very fine day, about 6 weeks later, Master Andreas came to my Aunt Catherine to fetch me to see the picture. The miraculous draught of fishes was hanging against the wall opposite 2 lofty windows. What a sublime work! Is it possible it can be in the power of man to produce such things? Kappelmans had thrown all his heart and all his genius into the work. The soul of Van Marius ought to be satisfied. I could have remained there till night, mute with admiration, before this incomparable painting, if my old master, tapping me on the shoulder, had not said very solemnly, "You find that very fine, do you not, Christian? Well, Van Marius had a dozen of similar chef d'oeuvre in his head. Unfortunately, he was too fond of ale and scheedam. His belly was his destruction. It is the fault of us Dutchmen. You are young. Let this serve you for a lesson. Sensuality is the enemy of everything that is great." End of section 2. Section 3 of Stories of the Rhine by Erckmann-Chatrian. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. The Child Stealer. 1. In 1815 there was daily to be seen wandering in the Hesse-Darmstadt quarter of Mayence a tall, emaciated woman, with hollow cheeks and haggard eyes, a frightful picture of madness. This unfortunate woman, named Christine Evig, a mattress maker, living in the narrow street called Petit Volet, at the back of the cathedral, had lost her reason through the occurrence of a terrible event. Passing one evening along the winding street of the Trois Bateaux, leading her little daughter by the hand, and suddenly observing that she had for a moment let go of the child, and no longer heard the sound of its steps, the poor woman turned and called, "Dubsha, Dubsha, where are you?" Nobody answered, and the street, as far as she could see, was deserted. Then running, crying, calling, she returned to the port, and peered into the dark water lying beneath the vessels. Her cries and moans drew the neighbors about her. The poor mother explained to them her agonies. They joined her in making fresh search, but nothing, not a trace, not an indication, was discovered to throw light on this frightful mystery. From that time Christine Evig had never again set foot in her home. Night and day she wandered through the town, crying in a voice growing feebler and more plaintive, "Dubsha, Dubsha." She was pitied. Sometimes one, sometimes another kind person gave her food and cast-off clothes, and the police, in presence of a sympathy so general, did not think it their duty to interfere and shut Christine up in a madhouse, as was usual at that period. She was left, therefore, to go about as she liked, without anyone troubling himself concerning her ways. But what gave to the misfortune of Christine a truly sinister character was that the disappearance of her little daughter had been, as it were, the signal for several events of the same kind. A dozen children disappeared in an astonishing and inexplicable manner, several of them belonging to the upper rank of townspeople. These events usually occurred at nightfall, when the street passengers were few, and every one of them was hastening home from business. A willful child went out to the doorstep of its parents' house, its mother calling after, "Karl, Ludwig, Lottele," absolutely like poor Christine. No answer. They rushed in every direction. The whole neighborhood was ransacked. All was over. To describe to you the inquiries of the police, the arrests that were made, the perquisitions, the terror of families, would be a thing impossible. To see one's child die is doubtless frightful, but to lose it without knowing what has become of it, to think that we shall never look upon it again, that the poor little being, so feeble and tender, which we have pressed to our heart with so much love, is ill, perhaps. It may be calling for us, and we unable to help it. This passes all imagination, exceeds the power of human expression to convey. Now one evening, in the October of that year, 1817, Christine Evig, after having strayed about the streets, had seated herself on the trough of the bishop's fountain, her long gray hair hanging about her face, and her eyes wandering dreamily into vacancy. The servant girls of the neighborhood, instead of stopping to chat as usual at the fountain, made haste to fill their pitchers and regain their masters' houses. The poor madwoman stayed there alone, motionless, under the icy shower in which the Rhine mist was falling. The high houses around, with their sharp gables, their latticed windows, their innumerable dormer lights, were slowly becoming enveloped in darkness. The bishop's chapel clock struck 7. Still Christine did not move, but sat shivering and murmuring, "Dubsha, Dubsha." At that moment, while the pale hue of twilight yet lingered on the points of the roofs, before finally disappearing, she suddenly shuddered from head to foot, stretched forward her neck, and her face, impassible for nearly 2 years, was lit with such an expression of intelligence that Councillor Trump's servant, who was at that moment holding her pitcher to the spout, turned in astonishment at seeing this gesture of the madwoman's. At the same moment a woman, with head bent down, passed along the pavement at the other side of the square, holding in her arms something that was struggling with her, enveloped in a piece of linen cloth. Seen through the rain, this woman was of striking aspect. She was hurrying away like a thief who has succeeded in effecting a robbery, slinking along in the shadow, her rags dragging behind her. Christine Evig had extended her shrunken left hand, and a few inarticulate words fell from her lips, but suddenly a piercing cry escaped from her bosom. "It is she!" And bounding across the square, in less than a minute, she reached the corner of the Rue de Vieille-Ferraille, where the woman had passed out of her sight. But there was Christine, stopped, breathless. The stranger was lost in the darkness of that filthy place, and nothing was to be heard but the monotonous sound of the water falling from the house gutters. What had passed through the madwoman's mind? What had she remembered? Had she had some vision, one of those insights of the soul that for a moment unshroud to us the dark depths of the past. I do not know. By whatever means, she had recovered her reason. Without losing a moment in pursuing the vanished apparition, the unfortunate woman hurried up the Rue des Trois Bateaux, as if carried along by vertigo, and turning at the corner of the Place Gutenberg, rushed into the hall of the provost, Caspar Schwartz, crying in a hoarse voice, "Monsieur le Prévôt, the child-stealers are discovered! Quick, listen, listen!" The provost was just finishing his evening meal. He was a grave, methodical man, liking to take his ease after supper. Thus the sight of this phantom greatly disturbed him, and setting down the cup of tea he was in the act of raising to his lips, he cried, "Good God, am I not to have a single moment's quiet during the day? Can there possibly be a more unfortunate man than I am? What does this mad woman want with me now? Why was she allowed to come in?" Recovering her calmness at these words, Christine replied in a suppliant manner, "Ah, monsieur, you ask if there is a being more unfortunate than yourself. Look at me! Look at me!" Her voice was broken with tears. Her clenched hands put aside the long gray hair from her pale face. She was terrible to see. "Mad, yes, my God, I have been mad. The Lord is his mercy hid me from my misfortune, but I am mad no longer. Oh, what I have seen! That woman was carrying off a child, for it was a child, I am sure of it."
"Go to the devil with your woman and child. Go to the devil!" cried the provost, seeing the unfortunate woman throw herself upon her knees. "Hans, Hans!" he cried. "Will you come and turn this woman out of doors? To the devil with the office of provost. It brings me nothing but annoyance." The servant appeared, and Monsieur Caspar Schwartz pointed to Christine. "Show her out," he said. "Tomorrow I shall certainly draw out a warrant in due form to rid the town of this unfortunate creature. Thank heaven we are not without madhouses." The madwoman laughed dreamily, while the servant, full of pity for her, took her by the arm, and said gently to her, "Come, Christine, come." She had relapsed into madness, and murmured, "Dubsche, dubsche." 2. While these things were passing in the house of the provost, Caspar Schwartz, a carriage came down the Rue de l'Arsenal, the sentinel on guard before the shot park recognizing the equipage as that of Count Diedrich, colonel of the Imperial Regiment of Hildburghausen, carried arms. A salute answered him from the interior of the vehicle. The carriage, drawn at full speed, seemed as if going toward the Porte de la Manche, but it took the Rue de l'Homme de Fer and stopped before the door of the provost's house. As the colonel, in full uniform, got out, he raised his eyes and appeared stupefied, for the shocking laughter of the madwoman made itself heard outside the house. Count Diedrich was a man about 35 or 40 years of age, tall, with brown beard and hair, and a severe and energetic physiognomy. He entered the provost's hall abruptly, saw Hans leading Christine, and without waiting to have himself announced, walked into Monsieur Schwartz's dining room, exclaiming, "Monsieur, the police of your district is intolerable. 20 minutes ago I stopped in front of the cathedral, at the moment of the Angelus. As I got out of my carriage, seeing the Countess Hildburghausen coming down the steps of the cathedral, I moved on one side to allow her to pass. I then found that my son, a child of 3 years old who had been seated by my side, had disappeared. The carriage door on the side towards the bishop's house was open. Advantage had been taken of the moment when I was letting down the carriage steps to carry off the child. All the search and inquiries of my people have been fruitless. I am in despair, monsieur, in despair." The colonel's agitation was extreme. His dark eyes flashed like lightning through the tears he tried to repress. His hand clasped the hilt of his sword. The provost appeared dumbfounded. His apathetic nature was distressed at the idea of having to exert himself and pass the night in giving orders, and going about from place to place, and sure to recommence for the 100th time the hitherto fruitless search. He would rather have put off the business till the next day. "Monsieur," replied the colonel, "understand that I will not be trifled with. You shall answer for my son with your head. It is your place to watch over the public security. You fail in your duty. It is scandalous. Oh, that I at least knew who has struck the blow." While pronouncing these incoherent words, he paced up and down the room with clenched teeth and somber looks. Perspiration stood on the purple brow of Master Schwartz, who murmured, as he looked at the plate before him, "I am very sorry, monsieur, very sorry, but this is the 10th. The thieves are much more clever than my detectives. What would you have me do?" At this imprudent response, the colonel bounded with rage, and, seizing the fat provost by the shoulders, dragged him out of his armchair. "What would I have you do? Is that the answer you give to a father who comes to demand of you his child?"
"Let me go, monsieur, let me go," roared the provost, choking with alarm. "In heaven's name, calm yourself. A woman, a mad woman, Christine Evig, has just been here. She told me— Yes, I remember. Hans! The servant, who had overheard all at the keyhole, entered the room instantly. "Monsieur?" "Fetch back the mad woman. She's still outside, monsieur." "Well, bring her in. Pray sit down, Colonel." Count Diedrich remained standing in the middle of the room, and a moment afterwards Christine Evig returned, haggard and laughing insanely as she had gone out. Hans and the servant girl, curious as to what was passing, stood in the open doorway, open-mouthed. The colonel, with an imperious gesture, made a sign to them to go away. Then, crossing his arms and confronting Master Schwartz, he cried, "Well, monsieur, what kind of intelligence do you expect me to obtain from this unfortunate creature?" The provost moved as if he were going to speak. His fat cheeks shook. The madwoman uttered a sort of sobbing laughter. "Monsieur," said the provost at length, "this woman's case is the same as your own. 2 years ago she lost her child, and that drove her mad." The colonel's eyes overflowed with tears. "Go on," he said. "When she came here a little while ago, she appeared to have recovered a spark of reason, and told me—" Master Schwartz paused. "What did she tell you, monsieur?" "That she had seen a woman carrying a child." "Ah!" Thinking that she was only raving, I sent her away. The colonel smiled bitterly. "You sent her away?" he cried. "Yes, she seemed to me to have relapsed into her state of madness." "Parbleu!" cried the count in a tone of thunder. "You refuse assistance to this unfortunate woman. You drive away from her her last gleam of hope instead of sustaining and defending her, as it is your duty to do. And you dare to retain your office. You dare to receive its emoluments." He walked up close to the provost, whose wig trembled, and added in a low, concentrated tone, "You are a scoundrel. If I do not recover my child, I'll kill you like a dog." Master Schwartz, his staring eyes nearly starting from his head, his hands helplessly open, his mouth clammy, said not a word. Terror held him by the throat, and besides he knew not what to answer. Suddenly the colonel turned his back on him, and going to Christine, looked at her for a few seconds. Then raising his voice, "My good woman," he said, "try and answer me. In the name of God, in the name of your child, where did you see that woman?" He paused, and the poor woman murmured in a plaintive voice, Dubshe, they've killed her." The count turned pale and, carried away by terror, seized the madwoman's hand. "Answer me, unfortunate creature! Answer me!" he cried. He shook her. Christine's head fell back. She uttered a peal of frightful laughter and said, Yes, it is done. The wicked woman has killed it." The count felt his knees giving way and sank rather than sat down upon a chair, his elbows upon the table, his pale face between his hands, his eyes fixed, as if gazing upon some fearful scene. The minutes passed slowly in silence. The clock struck 10. The sound made the colonel start. He rose, opened the door, and Christine went out. "Monsieur," said Master Schwartz. "Hold your tongue," interrupted the colonel with a withering look. And he followed the madwoman down the dark street. A singular idea had come into his mind. "All is lost," he said to himself. "This unhappy woman cannot reason, cannot comprehend questions put to her, but she has seen something. Her instinct may lead her." It is almost needless to add that the provost was amazed. The worthy magistrate lost not a moment in double-locking his door. That done, he was carried away by a noble indignation. "A man like me threatened, seized by the collar. Colonel, we'll see whether there are any laws in this country. Tomorrow morning I shall address a complaint to the Grand Duke and expose him to the conduct of his officers, etc." 3. Meanwhile the colonel followed the mad woman, and by a strange effect of the super-excitation of his senses, saw her in the darkness through the mist as plainly as in broad daylight. He heard her sighs, her confused words, in spite of the continual moan of the autumn winds rushing through the deserted streets. A few late townspeople, the collars of their coats raised to the level of their ears, their hands in their pockets, and their hats pressed down over their eyes, passed, at infrequent intervals, along the pavements. Doors were heard to shut with a crash. An ill-fastened shutter banged against a wall. A tile torn from a housetop by the wind fell into the street. Then again, the immense torrent of air whirled on its course.
drowning with its lugubrious voice all other sounds of the night. It was one of those cold nights at the end of October, when the weathercocks, shaken by the north wind, turn giddily on the high roofs and cry with shrilly voices, "Winter, winter, winter has come!" On reaching the wooden bridge, Christine leaned over the pier and looked down into the dark, muddy water that dragged itself along in the canal. Then, rising with an uncertain air, she went on her way, shivering and murmuring, "Oh, it is cold." The colonel, clutching the folds of his cloak with one hand, pressed the other against his heart, which felt almost ready to burst. 11 o'clock was struck by the church of St. Ignatius, then midnight. Christine Evig still went on. She had passed through the narrow streets of l'Imprimerie, of the Maillet, of the Halle au Vin, of the Vieille Boucherie, and of the Fosse de l'Évêché. 100 times in despair the Count had said to himself that this nocturnal pursuit would lead to nothing. But remembering that it was his last resource, he followed her as she went from place to place, stopping, now by a cornerstone, now in the recess of a wall, then continuing her uncertain course, absolutely like a homeless brute wandering at hazard in the darkness. At length, towards 1 o'clock in the morning, Christine came once more into the Place de l'Évêché. The weather appeared to have somewhat cleared up. The rain no longer fell. A fresh wind swept the streets, and the moon, now and then surrounded by dark clouds, now and then shining in full brilliancy, shed its rays, smooth and cold as blades of steel, upon the 1,000 pools of water lying in the hollows of the paving stones. The madwoman tranquilly seated herself on the edge of the fountain, in the place she had occupied some hours before. For a long time she remained in the same attitude, with dull eyes and her rags clinging to her withered form. All the Count's hopes had vanished. But at one of those moments when the moon, breaking through the clouds, threw its pale light upon the silent edifices, she rose suddenly, stretched forward her neck, and the colonel, following the direction of her gaze, observed that it was fixed on the narrow lane of the Vieille Ferraille, about 200 paces distant from the fountain. At the same moment she darted forward like an arrow. The Count followed instantly upon her steps, plunging into the block of tall old buildings that overlooked the church of St. Ignatius. The mad woman seemed to have wings. 10 times he was on the point of losing her, so rapid was her pace through these winding lanes, encumbered with carts, dung heaps, and faggots piled before the doors on the approach of winter. Suddenly she disappeared into a sort of blind alley, pitch dark, and the colonel was obliged to stop, not knowing how to proceed further. Fortunately, after a few seconds, the sickly yellow rays of a lamp pierced the darkness of the depths of this filthy hole through a small cracked window pane. This light was stationary, but now and then it was momentarily obscured by some intervening figure. Someone was evidently awake in that foul den. What was being done? Without hesitation, the colonel went straight towards the light. In the midst of the obstructions, he found the madwoman standing in the mire, her eyes staring, her mouth open, looking at the solitary glimmer. The appearance of the Count did not seem at all to surprise her. Only pointing to the window on the first floor in which the light was seen, she said, "It's there," in an accent so impressive that the Count started. Under the influence of this impulse, he sprang towards the door of the house, and with one pressure of his shoulder burst it open. Impenetrable darkness filled the place. The madwoman was close behind him. "Hush!" she cried, and once more giving way to the unfortunate woman's instinct, the Count remained motionless and listened. The profoundest silence reigned in the house. It might have been supposed that everybody in it was either sleeping or dead. The clock of St. Ignatius struck 2. A faint whispering was then heard on the first floor. Then a vague light appeared on a crumbling wall at the back. Boards creaked above the colonel, and the light came nearer and nearer, falling first upon a ladder staircase, a heap of old iron in a corner, a pile of wood. Further on, upon a sash window looking out into a yard, bottles right and left, a basket of rags, a dark, ruinous, and hideous interior. At last a tin lamp with a smoky wick, held by a small hand, as dry and sinewy as the claw of a bird of prey, was slowly projected over the stair rail, and above the light appeared the head of an anxious-looking woman with hair the color of tow, bony cheeks, tall ears standing almost straight out from the head, light gray eyes glittering under deep brows. In short, a sinister being, dressed in a filthy petticoat, her feet in old shoes, her fleshless arms bare to the elbows, holding a lamp in one hand and in the other a sharp slater's hatchet. Scarcely had this abominable being glared into the darkness that she rushed back up the stairs with astonishing agility. But it was too late. The colonel had bounded after her, sword in hand, and seized the old witch by the petticoat. "My child, wretch!" he cried. "My child!" At this roar of the lion, the hyena turned and struck at random with her hatchet. A frightful struggle ensued. The woman, thrown down upon the stairs, tried to bite. The lamp which had fallen on the ground burned there, its wick sputtering in the damp and throwing changing shadows on the dusky wall. "My child!" repeated the colonel. "My child, or I'll kill you!"
Yes, you shall have your child,"
replied the breathless woman in an ironical tone.
"Oh, it's not finished. Not, I've got good teeth. The coward to strangle me. Oh, above there. Are you deaf? Let me go. I'll tell you all."
She was nearly exhausted when another witch, older and more haggard, tottered down the stairs, crying, "I'm here." The wretch was armed with a large butcher's knife, and the count, looking up, saw that she was selecting a place in which to strike him between the shoulders. He felt himself lost. A providential accident alone could save him. The madwoman, until then a motionless spectator, sprang upon the old woman, crying,
"It is she! There she is! Oh, I know her! She shall not escape me!"
The only answer was a gush of blood, which inundated the landing place. The old woman had cut the unfortunate Christine's throat. It was the work of a second. The colonel had time to spring to his feet and put himself on his guard, seeing which the two frightful old women fled rapidly up the stairs and disappeared into the darkness. The flame of the smoky lamp flickered in the oil, and the count took advantage of its last rays to follow the murderers. But on reaching the top of the stairs, prudence counseled him not to abandon this point of egress. He heard Christine breathing below, and drops of blood fell from stair to stair in the midst of the silence. It was horrible. On the other hand, a sound at the back of the den made the count fear that the two women were attempting to escape by the windows. Ignorance of the place for a moment prevented his moving from the spot on which he was standing, when a ray of light shining through a glass door allowed him to see the two windows of a room looking into the alley lit by a light from without. At the same time he heard in the alley a loud voice call out, "Hello? What's going on here? A door open!" Come this way! Cried the colonel. At the same moment, the light gleamed inside of the house. "Oh!" cried the voice. "Blood! The devil! I can't be mistaken. It's Christine!" "Come here!" repeated the colonel. A heavy step sounded on the stairs, and the hairy face of the watchman, Selig, with his big otter-skin cap and his goatskin over his shoulders, appeared at the head of the stairs, directing the light of his lantern towards the count. The sight of the uniform astonished the worthy fellow. "Who's there?" he inquired. "Come up, my good fellow, come up!" "Pardon, Colonel, but down below there's—" "Yes, a woman has been killed. Her murderers are in this house." The watchman ascended the few remaining stairs, and holding up his lantern threw a light on the place. It was a landing about 6 feet square, onto which opened the door of the room in which the two women had taken refuge. A ladder on the left hand, leading up to the garret story, still further contracted the space. The count's paleness astonished Selig. However, he dared not question the colonel, who asked, "Who lives here?" "Two women, a mother and daughter. They're called about the market the Jostles. The mother sells the butcher's meat in the market. The daughter makes sausage meat." The count, recalling the words uttered by Christine in her delirium, "Poor child, they have killed it," was seized with giddiness, and a cold perspiration burst from his forehead. By the most frightful chance he discovered at the same instant behind the stairs a little frock of blue and red tartan, a pair of small shoes, and a black cap, thrown there out of the light. He shuddered, but an invincible power urged him on to look, to contemplate with his own eyes. He approached, therefore, trembling from head to foot, and with a faltering hand raised these articles of dress. They had belonged to his child. Some drops of blood stained his fingers. Heaven knows what passed in the Count's heart. For a long while, leaning for support against the wall, with fixed eyes, arms hanging helplessly by his side, and open mouth, he remained as if stunned. But suddenly he sprang against the door with a yell of fury that terrified the watchman. Nothing could have resisted such a shock. Within the room was heard the crashing of the furniture which the two women had piled up to barricade the entrance. The building shook to its foundation. The Count disappeared into the obscurity. Then came shrieks, wild cries, imprecations, hoarse clamors from the midst of the darkness. There was nothing human in it. It was as if wild beasts were tearing each other to pieces in the recesses of their den. The alley filled with people. The neighbors from all sides rushed into the house, inquiring, "What's the matter? Are they murdering one another here?" Suddenly, all became silent, and the Count, covered with wounds from a knife, his uniform in tatters, came down the stairs. His sword, red to the hilt. Even his mustaches were blood-stained, and those who saw him must have thought that he had been fighting after the manner of tigers. What more is there for me to tell you? Colonel Dietrich was cured of his wounds, and disappeared from Mayence. The authorities of the town considered it judicious to keep these horrible details from the parents of the victims. I learned them from the watchman Selig himself, after he had grown old, and had retired to his village near Saarbrück. He alone knew these details, having appeared as witness at the secret inquiry, which was instituted before the criminal tribunal of Mayence. End of section 3. Section 4 of Stories of the Rhine by Erckmann-Chatrian. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Black and White. 1. Up to that moment, I had always regarded Theodor Blitz as a sort of mystical idiot, the power he assumed of keeping up a correspondence with invisible spirits by means of music composed of all the sounds in nature, the quivering of the leaves, the murmur of the wind, the hum of insects, etc., seemed to me ridiculous, nor was I alone in my opinion. It was all very well for him to say if the organ accuses religious feelings in us, if martial music excites martial ardor, and rural music tends to render us disposed to contemplation. The advent of Theodor Blitz, who came to us from Jena with a letter of introduction from Harmorius, with his black eyes, his neglected brown hair, his pale thin nose, his peremptory manner of speaking, and his mysterious ideas, caused some little confusion amongst us. We used to be surprised to see him get up suddenly, take 2 or 3 turns round the room, gesticulating all the time, turning the Swiss views on the walls with blue lakes, apple-green mountains, and red pathways strangely into ridicule. Then seat himself again, swallow his beer at a draught, begin a discussion on the music of Palestine, the lute of the Hebrews, on the introduction of the organ into our basilicas, on the Lefer or sabbatical epochs, etc., then frown, plant both elbows on the table, and lose himself in profound thought. Yes, that used to surprise serious people like ourselves, accustomed to a methodical way of thinking. But we were obliged to give way, and even Rothan, the engineer, though at first rather sarcastic in his remarks, finished by becoming reconciled to it, and left off contradicting the young chapel-master, whether he was right or wrong. It was clear Theodor Blitz possessed one of those nervous organizations which feel every change of temperature, and that year it was excessively hot. We had several violent storms towards the autumn, and we began to tremble for the vintage. One evening our society was assembled at the same table as usual, with the exception of old Olmet, the magistrate, and the young chapel-master. The burgomaster was discussing hailstorms and great hydraulic works. I was listening to the wind raging outside among the plane trees in the Schloss garden, and the rain beating against the windows. From time to time we heard a tile come rattling down from the roof, a door closed with a bang, a lone shutter beating against the wall, then the roar of the storm, bellowing, whistling, and groaning in the distance, as if all the spirits of the air were seeking and calling on one another in the darkness, while the living hid themselves and huddled themselves away in corners to avoid the ill luck attendant on meeting them. St. Landolph's chapel was striking 9 when Theodore Blitz entered, shaking his hat like a lunatic and crying out with his shrill voice,
"Now the devil is having it all his own way. Black and white are mingled together. 9 times 9,999,000 envies are fighting and beating one another to pieces. Go on, Erckmann. Wander abroad, ravage, devastate. The Amschaspods are put to fight. Oromez hides his face. What weather? What weather?"
He ran about the room while he was uttering this rhapsody, stretching out his long skinny legs and laughing spasmodically. We were all astounded at such an apparition. For some seconds no one uttered a word, but at last Rothen, the engineer, prompted by his caustic humor, cried out, "What fustian have you been declaiming, master organist? What do you mean by Amschaspods and the 999,000 envies? It is really too absurd. Where have you been to learn these singular expressions?" Theodore Blitz stopped short and shut one eye while the other, which remained wide open, twinkled with diabolical irony.
"Oh, engineer! Oh, sublime spirit! Master of the trowel and mortar!" said he. "Director of stonework! Ordainer of angles right, acute and obtuse! You are right! Yes, over and over again, right!"
Then he made him a bow in derision.
"Nothing exists but matter, the level, the rule, the compass, the revelations of Zoroaster, Moses, Pythagoras, Odin, and Christ. Harmony, melody, and sentiment are dreams unworthy of an intellect as clear as yours. Truth, eternal truth, belongs to you alone. Ha ha! I prostrate myself at the feet of your glory, as imperishable as that of Nineveh and Babylon."
Having delivered this address with inconceivable rapidity, he turned on his heel and laughed, but so shrilly that one would have thought it was the cock saluting the approaching morn. Rothal was beginning to grow angry, but at that moment the old magistrate Ulmet came in, his head buried in his great otter-skin cap, and his shoulders covered with a bottle-green great coat trimmed with fox-skin, the sleeves hanging down his back, his shoulders up to his ears, his eyelids half closed, and his great nose and fat cheeks dripping with rain. He was as wet as a duck. "Oh, Lord!" exclaimed the good man. "One must be mad to go out in such weather as this, especially after such exertions. 2 inquiries, 2 procès-verbal, and then the examinations. Bock beer and the society of old friends would tempt me to swim the Rhine." Outside the rain was falling in torrents. The water was pouring down the gutters, the rain pipes were overflowing, and the rivulets had swelled into rivers. While the magistrate was talking, he took off his otter-skin cap, opened his pelisse, to take his long pipe from Ulm and his tobacco pouch and his box of matches out of his pocket, which he laid carefully on the table. Then he hung his cap and greatcoat on the curtain rod of the window and called out, "Brouwer!" "What does the magistrate wish?" "You would do well to close the shutters. This deluge of rain may very probably end in a thunderstorm." The brewer immediately went out, and the shutters were closed, and the old judge sat down in his corner and sighed deeply. "You know what has happened, burgomaster?" said he sadly. "No, my old friend Christoffel." Before he replied, Ulmet looked attentively all around the room. "We are alone, my friends," said he, "so I can venture to tell you. About 3 this afternoon they found poor Gretel Dick in the mill dam at Holderloch." "In the mill dam at Holderloch!" we all exclaimed mechanically. "Yes, with a rope round her neck." That you may understand me more fully why these words shocked us all so much, I should tell you that Gretel Dick was one of the prettiest girls in Vickux-Brisach, tall and dark with blue eyes and rosy cheeks, the only daughter of the old Anabaptist Peter Dick, who rented the extensive lands belonging to the Schlossgarten. It had been noticed for some time past that she had become grave and out of spirits. She was once so gay at the washing place in the morning, and at the fountain in the evening. She had been seen crying, and her trouble was supposed to arise from the incessant pursuit of Safari Mutz, the son of the postmaster, a strong, hard fellow with aquiline nose and black curly hair, who followed her like her shadow, and never let go her arm on Sundays at the dance. Their marriage had been talked about, but Father Mutz, his wife, Karl Bremer, his son-in-law, and his daughter, Sophiel, were very much opposed to the match, alleging as a reason that a heathen could not be admitted into the family. Gretel had been missing for 3 days. No one knew what had become of her, and so you may imagine the 1,000 conjectures which were formed as to how she met her death. No one cared about the discussion about invisible spirits between Rothal the engineer and Theodore Blitz. All eyes were turned upon Christoffel Ulmet, who with his large head bent down and his thick white eyebrows contracted, was filling his pipe in a thoughtful mood. "And Mutz, Safari Mutz, what has become of him?" the burgomaster inquired. The old man's cheeks colored up a little, and after some seconds' reflection he replied, "Safari Mutz has disappeared."
"Disappeared?" cried little Cleiss. "That is as much as to say he murdered her."
"So it appears to me," said the old magistrate slowly. "One does not run away for nothing. In fact, we have made a domiciliary visit at his father's, and we found the whole family in a state of agitation. They seemed terribly alarmed. The mother cried and tore her hair. Their daughter had put on her Sunday clothes and was dancing about the house like a madwoman. It was impossible to learn anything from them. As to Gretel's father, the poor man is in despair. He will not say anything which might compromise his daughter's reputation, but he is positive that Gretel Dick left the farm of her own goodwill last Tuesday to follow Safari. This fact is proved by all their neighbors. Well, the gendarmes have taken it in hand. We shall see what they can do." There was a long silence, while out of doors the rain came down in torrents. "It is horrible," the burgomaster suddenly called out. "It is horrible when we think that fathers of families who bring up their children in the fear of God are exposed to such misery as this." "Yes," replied Ulmet, lighting his pipe, "so it is. It is all very well to say that everything takes place according to the ordering of the Lord. In my opinion, the spirits of darkness have a great deal more to do with our affairs than is good for us. For one honest man, how many faithless and lawless vagabonds do we meet with? And for one good action, how many crimes? Let me ask you, my friends, if the devil would only count his flock." He had not time to finish his sentence before a vivid flash of lightning shone through the cracks in the shutters, and made the light of the lamp seem dim, almost immediately followed by a clap of thunder. Such a clap! Short, crashing, something to make your hair stand on end. One would have thought the earth was about to open. The church of St. Landolph was just striking the half-hour, and the vibration of the bells seemed only a few yards distant, when a weak, plaintive voice was heard a long way off, calling, "Help! Help!" "Someone is calling for help," said the burgomaster. "Yes," repeated the rest, looking very pale and attentively listening. And while we all sat there in a state of terror, Rothal began to sneer and call out, Ah, it is only Mademoiselle Roussel's cat singing a love song to Mr. Roller, the young tenor on the first floor." Then, raising his voice in his hand like a tragic actor, he added, "Midnight was striking at the castle chapel." This tone of mocking raised general indignation. "Evil be to those who turn such events as these into subjects of ridicule," said old Christoffel, rising. He walked towards the door with solemn steps, and we all followed him, even the fat brewer, holding his cotton nightcap in his hand and muttering a prayer as if just about to appear in his Maker's presence. Rothal was the only one who did not move. I kept behind the others, stretching my neck out to look over their shoulders. The glass door hardly opened before there came another flash of lightning. The street, with its pavement washed white by the rain, its overflowing gutters, its thousands of windows, its ruinous gables, and its signs, seemed to spring distinctly forward out of the night, then retreated and disappeared in darkness. That one glimpse showed me St. Landolph's tower and its numerous little statues draped in light by the lightning, the lower part of the bells, their clappers and their ropes leading down into the nave, the storks' nests demolished by the storm, the little ones with their beaks wide open and the old bird hovering about them, flying round the sparkling spire with her projecting head, neck thrown back, and her long legs stretched out behind her as if in defiance of the zigzag streaks of lightning all round her. It was a strange vision, like a Chinese painting. We all stood with our mouths open on the threshold of the brewery door, asking one another, "What did you hear, Mr. Ulmet? Did you see anything, Mr. Cleiss?" Just then a plaintive mew was heard over our heads, and a regiment of cats scrambled along the gutter. A burst of laughter was heard in the room at the same time. "Well," cried the engineer, "did you hear them? Was I wrong after all?" "It was nothing, thank God," said the old magistrate. "Let us go in. It is beginning to rain again." And as he went to take his seat again, he said,
You must not be surprised, Mr. Rothau, that an old man like myself loses his presence of mind when heaven and earth meet together thus, and love and hatred joins hands together to develop crimes unknown in our country till now. Can you be surprised at it?" We had all taken our places again with a feeling of disgust at the engineer, who was the only one who had remained calm and who had seen us all tremble. We turned our backs on him and emptied our glasses one after the other in silence, while he leaned his elbow on the windowsill, whistling some military march, and beating time to it with his fingers against the glass, without condescending to notice our ill humor. This lasted a few minutes, when Theodore Blitz laughed and began again.
Mr. Rothau is triumphant. He has no faith in invisible spirits. Nothing disturbs him. His sight and hearing are good. What more does he require to convict us of folly and ignorance?"
"Why," replied Rothau, "I did not venture to say as much. But you define it so cleverly, Master Organist, that I will not contradict you, particularly as far as regards yourself. For, with respect to my old friends, Schultz, Olmet, Kleiss, and the rest, the case is different, very different. It may happen to us to have unpleasant dreams, only it must not become a regular habit." Instead of making any reply to this direct attack, Blitz leaned his head out of the window and seemed to listen to some noise outside.
"Hush,"
said he, looking back at us.
"Hush."
He raised his finger at the same time, and his expression of countenance was so remarkable that we all listened with a vague sensation of terror. At the same time, heavy steps could be heard splashing through the swollen gutter. A hand felt for the door-handle, and the chapel-master called, or rather screamed out to us, "Be calm! Listen and behold! May the Lord protect us!" The door opened, and Safari Mutz appeared. Were I to live 1,000 years, that man's face will always be impressed on my memory. There he stands. I see him now. He staggers forward, pale as death, his eyes dull and glassy, his hair hanging over his forehead, his blouse rolled up round his waist, a heavy stick in his hand. A rivulet of mud streams from his clothes. He stops, coughs, and says in a whisper, as if he was speaking to himself, "Here I am. Arrest me. Cut my head off. That's what I want." Then rousing himself and looking at us all round, one after the other, with an expression of terror, "I said something. What did I say? The burgomaster is there. And Olmet, the magistrate, too." He turned to make his escape, but something he seemed to see in the darkness forced him back into the room. Theodore Blitz had risen from his chair, and after casting a warning glance at us, he walked up to Mutz and said to him confidentially,
"Is he there?"
"Yes," said the assassin in the same mysterious tone.
"He has been following you, hasn't he?"
"From Fischbach."
"Always behind you?"
"Yes, always behind me."
"Just so," said the organist. "Just so."
And he looked round at us again.
"So it is always. Well, stay, Safari. Sit down by the fire. Brouwer, go and fetch the gendarme."
At the word gendarmes, the wretch grew paler than ever, and would again have turned to fly, but the same feeling of horror drove him back, and he sank down at a table in the corner and buried his face in his hands. "If I had but known it! If I had only known it!" he cried. We were all more dead than alive. The brewer had just left the room. Not a breath could be heard in the room. The old magistrate had laid his pipe down. The burgomaster looked at me in consternation. Rothau left off whistling. Theodore Blitz was seated at the end of a bench, with his legs crossed, and seemed occupied in watching the rain trickling down the window panes. And so we sat for a quarter of an hour, afraid all the time the assassin would make up his mind to escape. But he never stirred. His long hair hung down between his fingers while the water ran in a stream from his clothes onto the floor. At last the clank of arms was audible outside. The two gendarmes, Warner and Keltz, appeared on the threshold. Keltz just glanced at the assassin, took off his hat, and said, "Good evening, your worship," to the magistrate. Then he walked in and quietly handcuffed Safari, who still tried to hide his face. "Come, follow me, my lad," said he. "Werner, close up." A third gendarme, a short, thick fellow, was just visible in the gloom of the passage, and the whole troop moved off. The wretched man made not the slightest resistance. We looked at one another's pale faces in silence.
"Good evening, gentlemen,"
said the organist, and he walked off. We all were so lost in reflection on what we had just witnessed that we rose and went each to his home without uttering an observation. I am not ashamed to confess that before I reached my own door, I had turned my head round 20 times, fancying I could hear the other, that one who had followed Safari Mutz, close behind me. And when at last, thanks be to heaven, I found myself in my own room, before putting out the light and getting into bed, I took the wise precaution of looking under it to convince myself that the personage, whoever he might be, was not there. I believe, too, that I repeated a certain prayer to prevent him from strangling me in my sleep. Well, we are not philosophers on all occasions. 2. In those days we used to pass our evenings at Brouwer's Brewery, which stands in the square at Vieux-Brisach. Soon after 8 came Frederick Schultz, the notary, Franz Martin, the burgomaster, Christoffel Ulmut, the magistrate, Councillor Kleiss, Rothau, the engineer, Theodor Blitz, the young organist, one after the other, and several other honorable burghers of the town who all sat at the same table and discussed their foaming bock beer like neighbors. It is because these various melodies are invocations to the genii of the earth, which make a sudden appearance amongst us, act upon our organs, and make us sharers in their own essence. These were all obscure terms to me, and I have hitherto entertained no doubt that the organist's upper works were somewhat deranged. But since this last occurrence, my opinion in this respect had been very much shaken, and I said to myself that man, after all, is not a purely material being, that we consist of a body and soul, that to attribute everything to the body, and to seek thereby to explain everything, is far from reasonable. That the nervous fluid, agitated by the currents of air, is quite as difficult to understand as the direct action of invisible forces. One knows not why a simple, pleasing movement according to the rules of counterpoint can provoke emotions, either agreeable or terrible, raise our soul towards God, bring it face to face with nothingness, or awaken us all the ardor of existence, enthusiasm, love, fear, and pity. No, I no longer considered this a satisfactory explanation. The chapelmaster's ideas seemed now grander, more forcible, juster, and more acceptable in every point of view. Besides, what explanation could a nervous sensation afford of Safari Mutz's appearance at the brewery? Or how account for the wretch's terror which forced him to give himself up? And the foresight of Blitz when he said, "Hush, hush, listen, here he comes, may the Lord protect us." All things considered, my prejudices against the invisible world were disappearing fast, and fresh facts occurred to confirm me in this new way of thinking. About a fortnight after the scene I have described, Safari Mutz was transferred by the gendarmes to the prison at Stuttgart. The 1,001 rumors put in circulation by Gretel Dick's death began to die away. The poor girl slept in peace behind the hill of the 3 fountains, and people began discussing the prospects of the approaching vintage. About 5 one evening, as I was leaving the custom-house stores, where I had been to taste some wine for Brouwer, who in this respect had more confidence in my palate than in his own, with a somewhat heavy head I turned my steps by chance towards the long plane-tree avenue behind St. Randolph's Church. On my right the Rhine was displaying its floods of blue, into which some fishermen were casting their nets. On my left rose the ancient fortifications of the town. The air was beginning to grow cool, the waters were singing their everlasting hymn. The breeze from the Schwarzwald was rustling among the leaves, and as I walked alone thinking of nothing, the sound of a violin struck my ear. I listened. No black-headed linnet ever sang its rapid trill with more grace or delicacy, nor was the flow of its execution ever more inspired with enthusiasm. But it resembled nothing I had ever heard before. There was neither pause nor time. It was a deluge of frenzied notes admirably accurate but without method and arrangement. And sometimes in the midst of an outburst of inspired melody, a shrill, sharp-cutting note would penetrate one's body like a knife. Theodor Blitz must be somewhere near, said I to myself as I pushed apart the branches of a hedge of elder trees at the foot of the slope. Then I found myself about 30 paces from the guardroom near a pond covered with duckweed, where enormous frogs showed their yellow throats. Farther on were the stables and large sheds, and then the dwelling-house, all in ruins. 5 or 6 hens were in the yard, which had a wall round it, with rusty iron gates. and under a shed rabbits were running about. They soon saw me and disappeared like shadows under the barn door. No sound to be heard but the murmur of the stream and the continued fantasia on the violin. How came Theodore Blitz there? The idea came into my head that he was trying some musical experiment on the Mutz family, and urged by curiosity I glided behind the wall to see what was going on at the farm. The windows were all wide open, and in a long, lower room with brown rafters across the ceiling, on a level with the yard, I could see a table spread with all the profusion noticeable in village fêtes. There were places laid for more than 30, but what stupefied me was to see only 5 persons present. The Father Mutz, serious and abstracted, in a black velvet coat with metal buttons, his large, bony, gray head, with his features contracted by some fixed idea, his hollow eyes staring at vacancy. The son-in-law thin and insignificant-looking, his shirt collar reaching above his ears, the mother in a high cambric cap with a look of bewilderment. The daughter, a pretty dark-eyed woman in a black sarcenet cap, with gold and silver spangles and a handkerchief with all the colors of the rainbow across her head. Last of all, Theodore Blitz, his cocked hat on his ear, his violin held tightly between his shoulder and his chin, his little sparkling black eyes, one long wrinkle traversing his cheek, and his elbows working up and down like a grasshopper scraping a tune in the heather. The shadows cast by the setting sun, the old timepiece with its earthenware dial painted with red and blue flowers, the corner of the gray and white checked curtain drawn across the recess, and the music, which became every moment more and more discordant, produced an impression upon me which I cannot describe. I was really and truly panic-struck. Was it a consequence of the Rudesheimer that I had been inhaling so long in the custom-house cellars? Was it the wan tints of approaching evening? I cannot say, but without looking any longer I stooped down and crept along the wall to reach the road, when a large dog jumped out at me as far as his chain would allow him, and made me call out with surprise. "Tyrrek!" cried the old postmaster, and then Theodore, having recognized me, ran out of the room, calling out,
"Here, Christian Specius! Come in, Christian! You arrived just in time!"
He crossed the court, and taking me by the arm,
"My dear friend," said he, with a strange animation in his voice and face, "this is the hour when black and white are struggling for the mastery. Come in, come in!"
The excited state in which he was frightened me, but he paid no attention to my observations and dragged me along so fast that it was useless to offer any resistance.
"You must know, my dear Christian," said he, "that this morning we baptized an angel of the Lord, little Nickel Safari Bremer. I celebrated his entry into this world of pleasure by a chorus of seraphim. And now, just fancy, 3/4 of our guests have taken flight. Come in, then. You are sure to be welcome."
He pushed me forward by the shoulders, and so, in spite of myself, I crossed the threshold of the door. All the members of the Mutz family turned round towards me. It was useless for me to refuse to sit down. They overpowered me with their welcome.
"He makes the 6th," cried Blitz, "and 6 is a lucky number."
The old postmaster came and shook hands with me warmly, saying as he did so, "Thanks, Mr. Specius, 1,000 thanks for coming. They cannot say now that all good people avoid us, that we are abandoned by God and man. You will stay with us to the end, will you not?"
"Yes," stammered the old woman with a look of entreaty. "Mr. Specius must stay with us to the end. He cannot refuse that."
I could then comprehend why the table was so large and the number of guests so small. All those who had been invited to the christening, mindful of poor Gretel Dick's fate, had excused themselves from attending. Their state of melancholy abandonment made my heart ache, and I could not help replying, "Most certainly, with pleasure, with great pleasure." Glasses were filled, and we drank a rough, strong old Marcobrunner wine, the harsh bouquet of which gave my thoughts a melancholy direction. The old woman laid her long skinny hand on my shoulder, saying, "One more glass, Monsieur Specius, only one glass," and I was afraid to refuse. At that moment Blitz drew his bow across the strings of his violin, and made me shiver in every limb.
"This, my friends," he called out, "is Saul's invocation to the Witch of Endor."
I should have made my escape if it had been practicable, but outside the dog was howling most lamentably. Night was approaching. The room was filling with specters. The strong marked features of the father mutts, his wandering eyes, and the painful contraction of his jaws did not encourage me to make a stir. Blitz continued strumming away his invocation to the Pythoness. His cheeks became more wrinkled, and the perspiration was streaming down his face. The postmaster filled up our glasses again and said to me in a savage, imperious tone, "Your health!" "The same to you, Monsieur Mutz," replied I, all in a tremble. All at once the child in its cradle began to cry, and Blitz, with diabolical irony, accompanied it on his violin, exclaiming, "That is the hymn of life! Ha ha ha! Little Nickel will sing it in a good many times before he loses the hair on his head." The old clock in its walnut case began to creak and grate, and when I looked up, surprised at the noise, I saw a thin, bald, hollow-eyed little automaton come out of a box above the dial. In short, a representation of death, which took 2 or 3 steps forward, and began to mow in jerks, sundry blades of grass painted on the edge of the case. Then at the last stroke it made a pirouette and disappeared in its box, whence it came. "The devil take the organist for bringing me here," said I to myself. "A gay christening truly, and pleasant people to be amongst." I filled up my glass once more to give myself courage. Come, it was my fate to do so. No one can change his destiny, and mine was, since time began, to leave the custom house this evening, take a turn in St. Landolph's Avenue, be brought in spite of myself into this den of cutthroats, drawn thither by Blitz's music, to drink Marco smelling of wormwood and cypress, and to see a wooden death mowing painted grass. It is funny. It is really very funny. And so I went on, thinking on the chances in our existence, when men think themselves free agents and all the time are led on by threads attached to the stars. The Magi have said so before, and we ought to believe them. So I sat mused and laughed in the shadow till the music ceased. A deep silence succeeded, only broken by the clock's monotonous ticking, and out of doors the moon on the other side of the Rhine was gently rising from behind the poplars, and its pale light ricocheted over the quivering waves. As I was watching it, a black boat crossed the line of light. A man was standing up in the boat, black too, a short cloak floating from his shoulders, and a large hat with wide brim and streamers attached to it. He passed on like a dream. My eyelids felt like lead. "Drink!" the organist called out. The glasses clinked. "How well the Rhine sings! It is singing Barthold Guterhoff's hymn," said the son-in-law. "Ave, Ave, Stella!" No one answered him, and at a distance, a long way off, we could hear 2 oars keeping time in their stroke. "This is the day Safari ought to receive his pardon," said the old postmaster suddenly in his harshest tones. No doubt he had long been pondering over this idea, and it was that which made him so gloomy. I shuddered. "He is thinking about his son," said I to myself. "His son, who ought to be hanged."
"His pardon?"
broke in the daughter with a strange laugh.
"Yes, his pardon."
Theodore tapped me on the shoulder, and leaning over to me whispered in my ear,
"The spirits are coming. They are here."
"If you talk of such things," cried the son-in-law, whose teeth were chattering, "if you talk so, I shall go."
"Go, you trembling fool!" cried the daughter. "We don't want you here."
"Well, then I shall go at once," said he, rising, and taking his hat down from the wall, he left the room with hurried steps. I saw him walk quickly past the window, and I envied him. How could I manage to get away? There was something moving on the wall opposite. On looking closely, I saw it was a cock. Farther on, between the broken palings, I could see the river shining and slowly casting its long waves on the shore. The light danced over them like a cloud of gulls with their silvery wings. My head was full of spectres and blue lights.
"Look here, Peter," cried the old woman. "Listen to me. You were the cause of all that has happened."
"I?" said the old man in a hollow tone. "How am I the cause?"
"Yes, you never had any pity on the boy. You never forgave him anything. Why would you not let him have the girl?"
"Wife," said the old man, "instead of accusing others, think of the blood which is on your own head. For the last 20 years you have done nothing but conceal your son's faults from me. Whenever I punished him for his bad disposition, his savage temper, or his drunkenness, you consoled him, cried with him, supplied him secretly with money, and said to him,
Your father loves you not, he is a hard man, and you lied to make him love you the more. You robbed me of the trust and respect which a child owes the father who loves and corrects him. And when he wanted to take up with this girl, I had not sufficient influence over him to make him obey me."
"You had only to say yes,"
yelled the old woman. "And I," said the old man, "I said no, because my mother, my grandmother, and all the men and women of my family would refuse to receive this heathen in heaven."
"In heaven?" answered the old woman. "In heaven!" "As long as I can remember," added the daughter in a whining tone, "Father never gave us anything but blows."
"Because you deserved them," replied the old man. "They gave me more pain than you."
"More pain indeed, more pain truly."
At that moment a hand touched my arm. I started. It was Blitz. A ray of moonlight streaming through the glass flooded him with light. His pale face and his extended arm stood out clear of the darkness. I looked in the direction to which his finger pointed, and I saw the most terrible sight I ever recollect having seen. A motionless blue shadow seemed to stand out in front of the window, above the white sheet of water. This shadow was a human form and seemed suspended between earth and heaven. His head hung forward on his breast, his elbows were squared behind his back, and his legs hung straight down with his feet coming to a point. And while I stared at him with horror-struck eyes, I noticed every detail in this ghastly apparition. I could recognize Safari Mutz, and above his shoulders the rope, the arm, and the framework of a gibbet. Then below these dismal details a white figure on its knees with disheveled hair, Gretel Dick, with her hands clasped in prayer. It seemed to me that all the others saw this apparition at the same time that I did, for I heard the old man groan out, "Oh, Lord God, have mercy upon us!" And the old woman gasped out,
"Safari is dead!"
She began to sob, and the daughter cried out,
"Safari, Safari!"
And then everything disappeared, and Theodore Blitz, taking me by the arm, said, "It is time to go." We left the house. The night was fine, and the wind murmured softly through the leaves. As we hurried along the plane tree avenue, a melancholy voice at a distance seemed to sing from the river the old German ballad. "The grave is deep and silent, and horrible in its bed. It spreads its gloomy curtain, o'er the country of the dead."
"Ah," cried Blitz, "if Gretel Dick had not been there, we should have seen the other, the tall, dark one, take Safari down. But she was praying for him. What is white remains still white."
And the voice at a distance still more faintly continued, "For never death re-echoes the nightingale's refrain, the rose which blooms above the tomb, the rose which blooms above the tomb is but a rose of pain." Altogether the horrible scene which had just passed before my eyes, and this distant melancholy voice which, becoming more and more distant, at last was lost in space, have remained fixed in my memory like a confused image of infinity, of that infinity which swallows us all up without pity and absorbs us irrevocably. Some, like Rothau the engineer, pass it over with a laugh. Some, like the burgomaster, tremble before it. Others lament it in plaintive accents, while again some, like Theodore Blitz, lean over the abyss and try to see the bottom. But it all comes to the same in the end, and there is nothing more true than the famous inscription on the temple of Isis. I am what I am. None have ever penetrated the mystery which surrounds me. None ever will penetrate it. End of section 4. Section 5 of Stories of the Rhine by Erckmann-Chatrian. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Hans Wieland, the Cabalist. 1. Hans Wieland, our professor of metaphysics, was what the Kabbalists call an archetype, tall, thin, with a livid complexion, red hair, hooked nose, gray eyes, an ironical curl of the lips, surmounted by a Prussian mustache. He used to surprise us all by the eccentricity of his displays in logic,
by the links in his arguments, by his pungent satirical strokes, which were as natural to him as thorns on a bramble, notwithstanding all university precedent. This original generally wore a high-crowned hat surmounted by a plume of cock's feathers, a frock trimmed with Brandenburgs, very wide trousers, and hussar boots, adorned with small silver spurs, which gave him a very martial appearance. Now, one fine morning, Master Hans, who liked me very much, and sometimes used to wink his eye in a most grotesque way and call me the son of the blue god, Master Hans, I say, came into my room and said, "Christian, I come to tell you will have to find some other professor of metaphysics. I leave for Paris in an hour." "For Paris? What are you going to do in Paris?" "Argue, discuss, wrangle. I can't say exactly," said he, shrugging his shoulders. "Then you may just as well remain here." "No, great things are about to happen, and besides, I have very good reasons for leaving." Then, going and peeping through the half-open door to assure himself that there was no one listening, he came and whispered in my ear, "You must know that I ran Major Krantz through the body this morning." "You?" "Yes, only fancy, the fool had the impudence to insist yesterday before everyone at Gambrinus's brewery that the soul is a mere affair of imagination. Of course, I broke my glass over his head, and so we had a meeting this morning at a retired spot near the river, and there I supplied him with a first-rate materialist argument." I looked at him aghast. "And now you are off to Paris?" I replied after a moment's silence. "Yes, I received my quarter's salary 3 or 4 days since. This will be money enough for my journey, but I have not a minute to lose. You know the severity of the laws respecting dueling. The least that could happen to me would be to pass 2 or 3 years in prison, and I must say I prefer taking myself out of the way." Hans Wieland told me all this, sitting at my study table and rolling a cigarette in his long, thin fingers. He then gave me the details of his duel with Major Krantz, and ended by saying he had come to ask me to give him my passport, as he knew I had recently been in France. "It is true," said he in conclusion, "that I may be some 8 or 10 years older than you, but we are both of us red-haired and lean. I need only cut off my mustache." "Master Hans," replied I with some emotion, "I wish it was in my power to render you the service you ask, but it is impossible. It is contrary to my philosophical principles. My passport is in the drawer of my desk next to Kant's Pure Reason. I will just go and take a turn under the acacias." "Good, good," replied he. "I understand your scruples, Christian. They do you honor. But I do not share them. Shake hands. I will take it all on myself." A few hours later in the day, the whole town was astounded at hearing that Hans Wieland, the professor of metaphysics, had run Major Krantz through the body and killed him on the spot. The police immediately went in search of the murderer. They ransacked his modest little apartments in the Rue de Alouette, but in vain. The major was buried with all the honors due to his rank, and for 6 weeks nothing else was talked about in the cafes and breweries. And then everything went on as before. About 15 months after this strange event, my worthy uncle Zacharias, the prorector, sent me to finish my studies in Paris. He wished me to succeed some day to the high position he was then occupying himself, and he wished to spare me no expense to make me what he called a luminary of science. So I set out for Paris at the end of October 1831. There is a quarter of Paris on the left bank of the Seine, between the Pantheon, the Val de Grace, and the Jardin des Plantes, which may be called with truth solitary. The houses there are tall and ruinous, the streets are dirty, and the inhabitants ragged. If it ever happens to you to lose yourself in this direction, people stop at the corners of the streets to look at you. Some come and stand staring at you from their doors and windows. They look at you with curiosity, and this feeling on their part extends to your pockets. At the farther end of this quarter, in the Rue Capot, there stands a narrow house enclosed by ancient walls, above which rises the branches of some centenarian elms. The house door is low and arched. Above it there is a lantern hanging from an iron rod. Above the lantern are 3 windows gleaming through the darkness. Above them 3 others, and so on up to a 6th floor. Thither, to Madame Gentil's, widow of a certain Gentil formerly corporal in the Royal Guard, I caused my luggage to be carried, at the particular recommendation of Monsieur Van de Bach, dean of the faculty, who remembered having occupied the same lodgings during the First Empire. I shudder even now when I think of the dismal hours spent in that abominable hole, seated in the winter close to a small fire, which gave out much more smoke than heat. Low in spirits, weak in health, and bored to death by the said Madame Gentil, who plundered me without remorse. I shall always remember that after 6 months' fog, rain, mud, and snow, one morning when there was a little sunshine, after passing the gate of the Jardin des Plantes, I noticed the buds of the early leaves just bursting. I was so affected I was obliged to sit down, and I cried like a child. I was 22, nevertheless, but I could not help calling the first of the Schwarzwald to mind. I could hear the cheerful voices of the girls singing, "Na si roulette vient encore une fois," and here I was in Paris. The sunshine had disappeared. I felt so lonely, left all to myself in this immense town. My heart overflowed at last. I could control my feelings no longer. That little glimpse of green had roused all my dormant affections. It is pleasant to weep and think of one's own distant home. After a few moments' weakness, I returned home full of newborn hopes, and I returned to my work with fresh courage. A flood of youth and life had made my heart beat more quickly. I said to myself, if Uncle Zacharias could only see me now, he would be proud of me. But I must in this place tell you of an occurrence at once both terrible and mysterious, the recollection of which awes me even now, and to this day upsets all my philosophical conclusions. Hundreds of times have I endeavored to account for it to myself, but always unsuccessfully. Just opposite my window on the other side of the street was a piece of waste ground between two lofty buildings, where quantities of weeds grew in unchecked luxuriance. Thistles, nettles, briars, and mosses, all those which delighted in shady places. 5 or 6 plum trees also grew untouched by the pruning knife in this damp enclosure, which was closed towards the street by a wall of dry stones. A notice painted on a board surmounted the ruined wall, with this inscription, "Land for sale, 425 mètres. Apply to Monsieur Tarago, solicitor, etc., etc." A rather crazy old barrel caught the water from the neighboring gutter and let it run over the grass. Millions of atoms, with their wings of gauze, gnats, and flies, hovered about over the green slime, and when by chance a ray of sunlight penetrated between the roofs, life warmed there like a golden dust. 2 enormous frogs showed their great heads above the surface, dragging their string-like legs across the weeds and swallowing thousands of insects at a time. At the end of this sink of filth there presented itself a shed whose roof consisted of damp and rotten boards, on which a large tortoise-shell cat crept up and down, listening to the sparrows chirruping in the trees, as it yawned, stretched itself, and unsheathed its claws with a melancholy air. I had often contemplated this corner of the world with a sort of feeling of dread. "Life swarms me everywhere, life preys upon life," said I to myself. Whence then is the source of this inexhaustible flood of existence, from the atom fluttering in a sunbeam up to the star lost in the depths of infinity? What principle can we discover to explain this limitless, incessant, eternal, and boundless prodigality of the great first cause? And with my forehead buried between my hands, I plunged into the abysses of the unknown world. Now about 11 one evening in the month of June, dreaming after this fashion, leaning on the sill of my window, I fancied I saw an indistinct figure creeping up to the wall. Then a door opened, and someone crossed the briars and nettles in the direction of the shed. All this occurred in the shadow cast by the adjoining buildings. Perhaps my senses deceived me, but the next morning about 5, on looking towards the same spot, I really saw a tall fellow come out from under the shed, and crossing his arms on his breast, begin to scrutinize me in turn. He was so tall, so thin, his clothes were so ragged, his hat so full of holes, that I had not the least doubt he was some criminal who had hidden himself there to escape the researches of the police, and who only left his den in the night to cut the throats of honest people. You may well imagine, then, how astonished I was when the man, waving his hat, began shouting, "Good day, Christian! Good day!" As I never returned his salutation, he crossed the enclosure, opened the door, and came into the empty street. The only observation I made was that he had a large, heavy stick in his hand, and I congratulated myself that I was so far removed from a tete-a-tete conversation with him. How could that individual know me, and what could he want of me? When he came opposite my window, he raised his long, thin arms, and cried in a most pathetic tone, "Come down, Christian, come down and let me shake hands with you.
Do not keep me standing here in the street." You may believe I was in no hurry to respond to this invitation. Then he began to laugh, and showing his magnificent white teeth under his red mustache, he said, "What? Have you forgotten Hans Wieland, your old professor of metaphysics? Must I show you his passport to prove it?" "Hans Wieland? Can it be he? Hans Wieland with those hollow cheeks, those sunken eyes? Hans Wieland in rags?" However, after examining him more closely, I recognized him. An irrepressible feeling of pity came over me. "My dear old professor, can it be you?" "The same. Come down, Christian, and let me in. We can talk better in your room than in the street." I hesitated no longer. Madame Gentil was not yet up. I unbolted the door, and Hans Wieland hugged me with delight. "My dear master," cried I, with my eyes full of tears, "what a state to find you in!" "Bah," replied he, "I am well enough in health, and that is the most important." "But come upstairs to my bedroom, and let me give you a change of clothes." "Why, I think I am very well as I am. Ha ha!" "But you must be hungry." "Not at all, Christian. I have lived for some time on rabbits' heads and fowls' legs at Flacotos. It is a sort of nourishment imposed upon me by the god of famine. I have now passed through my apprenticeship. My wasted stomach is now only a myth. It requires sustenance no longer, knowing as it does that its demands will not be attended to. I eat no more. I smoke a pipe occasionally, that is all. Alora's old fakir would envy me." And as I looked dubiously at him, "You seem surprised," he continued. "But you must know that to be initiated into the mysteries of Mithras imposes those trifling trials upon us before we can be endowed with any formidable power." As he spoke, he dragged me towards the entrance to the Jardin des Plantes. They had just unlocked the gate, and the sentry on duty, as he saw us coming up to him, was so astonished at the physiognomy and dilapidated appearance of my poor tutor that for a moment he hesitated whether he ought not to refuse to allow us to enter. But Hans Wieland did not seem to be at all conscious of the effect of his appearance produced, and walked quietly in. There was as yet no one in the garden. As we passed by the cage where the serpents were confined, Hans pointed it out to me with his stick, and murmured, "Pretty little creatures, Christian. I have always had a predilection for that description of reptile. They will not allow you to tread on their tails without biting." Then turning to the right, he led me into the labyrinth which leads to the cedar of Lebanon. "Let us stop here," said I, "at the foot of this tree." "No, let us go up to the lookout. We can see such a distance from it. I like to look out at Paris and breathe the fresh air, and I often spend hours at the observatory. In fact, it is that which has kept me in the neighborhood. You know, Christian, we all have our weak points." We had by this time reached the glass dome, and Hans Wieland seated himself on one of the two great fossil stones which are embedded in the rising ground. I remained standing opposite him. "Well, Christian," he began again, "what are you doing now? You are attending the lectures at the Sorbonne and the Collège de France, are you not? And are you as fond of metaphysics as you used to be?"
"Why, hardly."
I thought so. But how they are treated. One holds to forms and believes himself an idealist for the beautiful. The ideal beautiful consists of form. Well, another talks of substance. To him, substance is a primary idea. Do you understand that, Christian? Substance and primary idea? They are fools indeed. The cleverest among them is not without some degree of merit. He has concocted a sort of system with bits taken here and there, just as you would make a harlequin's jacket. And the French, who think themselves very clever metaphysicians, have surnamed him the modern Plato." And Hans Wieland, standing with his long grasshopper's legs wide apart, burst into a shout of laughter. Then, becoming suddenly calm again, he continued, "Alas, my poor Christian, my poor friend, what have the great schools of Albert the Great, or of Raymond Lullius, of Roger Bacon, of Arnaud de Villeneuve, of Paracelsus become? What is the microcosmos now? Where are the three principles, the intellectual, the celestial, the elementary? Where are they? The studies of Patrick Trichicasius, Corlay, André Cornu, Goglenius, Jean de Hagen, Moldinatus, Savonarola, and of so many others, and the curious experiments of Glaser, Lesage, and Le Vigoureux."
"But my dear master, they were only a set of poisoners," cried I.
"Poisoners? They are the greatest astrologers of modern times, the sole inheritors of the Kabbalah. The only poisoners are those quacks who teach but sophism and ignorance in their schools. Are you not aware that all the secrets of the Kabbalah are beginning to find their application? The pressure of steam, the principle of electricity, chemical analysis. To whom are these wonderful discoveries to be attributed, if not to astrologers? And our psychologists, our metaphysicians, what useful discoveries have they ever made, either applicable or true, to justify them in treating others as ignorant, and in attributing to themselves only the title of wise? Let us drop the subject, it stirs up my bile. And his face, till now impassive, wore an expression of savage ferocity. You must leave Paris, Christian, said he abruptly. You must go back to Tübingen. Why? Because the hour of vengeance draws nigh. Whose vengeance? Mine. And on whom do you seek to take vengeance? On the whole world. They have turned me into ridicule. They have despised Mahadevi. They have looked upon me as a madman, a visionary. They have denied the blue god to worship the yellow god. Evil be to this race of sensualists. He rose from his seat and gazed wistfully at the immense expanse of houses before him. His eyes glistened, and a smile lighted up his face. A few boats were floating slowly down the Seine. The garden at his feet were green with foliage. Carriers' wagons, trucks loaded with barrels of wine, carts full of vegetables, herds of cattle, flocks of sheep, droves of pigs were raising clouds of dust along the roads as far as the eye could reach. The city was humming like a beehive, a more magnificent sight I never beheld. "Oh, Paris, ancient sublime city that you are!" cried Wieland in bitter irony. "Ideal, sentimental Paris. Open wide your jaws. See liquids and solids approaching from every point in the horizon to keep up your animal spirits. Eat, drink, and sing. Trouble not yourself about the future. France exhausts herself in order to support you. From morning until evening does this nation of wits labor to create a pleasant leisure for yourself. What is there wanting to fill up the measure of your enjoyments? She sends you her finest and most generous wines, her flocks, her earliest fruits and vegetables, her most beautiful daughters, blooming with youth, the bravest of her young men, and all she asks in return is a revolution and a newspaper. Dearest Paris, center of light and civilization, etc., etc., etc. Paris, the promised land of paradox, the Philistines' heavenly Jerusalem, Sodom of the intellect, capital in chief of sensuality and of the yellow gods. Be proud of your destiny. If you cough, the earth trembles. If you stir, the world shivers. If you but yawn, all earth slumbers. What is mind compared to the incarnation of material force? Naught. You defy unseen influences. You mark them. But wait a while. One of the sons of Mahadevi and the goddess Kali is about to give you a lesson in metaphysics. And so Hans Wieland continued with increasing animation to give vent to his feelings. I had no doubt that want and privation had unsettled his brain. What could a poor devil without hearth or home do against the city of Paris? After uttering these threats, he became calmer, and noticing some of the idlers in the garden were beginning to ascend the labyrinth, he made me a sign to follow him, and we left the garden. "Christian," he began as we walked on, "I have a favor to ask you." "What?" "You know now where I have set up my retreat. There I will tell you everything, but you must promise me on your honor to carry out my orders on every point." "I have no objection, but on one condition, that is, you need not be uneasy. Your conscience will have no objection to offer." "Then I promise you cheerfully." "Enough." We had by this time arrived at the door in the wall. He pushed it open, and we went in. I cannot easily describe the sensation of disgust which crept over me when, after walking through the tall weeds of the den, I saw a quantity of bones heaped up in the shed. I was about to make a hasty retreat, but Hans Wieland was watching me. "Sit down there," said he in an imperious tone, pointing as he spoke to a large stone between two of the posts supporting the roof. I obeyed him. He took a small clay pipe from his pocket,
filled it with some to me unknown yellow substance, and began to smoke slowly. He then seated himself in front of me, with his legs extended, and his long stick between his knees. "Christian," he muttered, while a strange muscular contraction deepened the wrinkles in his cheeks and curled his nostrils. "Listen to me attentively, for it is absolutely necessary I should explain to you one of our mysteries, that you may carry out my intentions." He paused. His eyes grew dull, his brow contracted, and his lips closed so tightly that I could hardly see them. "Yes," he began again in solemn accents. "Yes, you must be made acquainted with one of the mysteries of Mithras. You see, Christian, one of the strangest circumstances in this world is that one half of the globe should be in full light, while the other is shrouded in darkness. The consequence is that half of the animal world is asleep, while the other remains awake. Now, nature which does nothing without a purpose, nature which simplifies everything, and so succeeds in obtaining infinite variety and absolute unity. Nature, having decided that every living thing should pass half its time lulled to sleep, has also decided by the same process of reasoning that one soul suffices for two bodies. This soul, then, transported from one hemisphere to the other as quick as thought, develops two existences in turn. While the soul is at the antipodes, the body sleeps. Its faculties are wandering while matter takes its rest. When the soul returns to assume the command over its organs, then the body awakes. Matter is compelled to obey mind. I need say nothing further. Such an argument is not touched upon in your course of philosophical study. For it is acknowledged fact that your professors are very learned without understanding anything. But that may explain to you how such strange ideas are often busy in your brain, may account for your strange dreams, your intuitive acquaintance with worlds you have never seen, and thousands of similar phenomena. What is commonly termed catalepsy, fainting fits, trances, magnetic clairvoyance, in short, all the phenomena attended on sleep in all its forms, draw their origin from the same law. Have you understood me, Christian? Certainly, assuredly. It is a sublime discovery. It is one of the least of the mysteries of Mithras, he continued with a grotesque smile. It is the first step of initiation. But listen to the conclusion drawn from the principle as far as I am concerned. The soul which animates me belongs alike to one of the followers of the Mahadevi, who live at the foot of Mount Abuji in the province of Sirsi on the southern frontier of Jundpur. He is an Agori, or if you like it better, an Agarapanti, celebrated for his austerities, his murders, and his sanctity. He is like me, an initiate of the third class. When he sleeps, I am awake. Do you comprehend me? Yes, replied I with a shudder. Well, now this is what I require at your hands. It is urgent that my soul should abide for 2 consecutive days at Disa, in the cavern of the goddess Kali. Such is my desire. Therefore must my body remain for that period inert. What I am now smoking is opium. My eyelids are growing heavy already. In a moment my soul will quit my body. Should I awake before the time fixed, you hear, at that moment give me a fresh dose of opium. You have sworn it. Woe be on your head if... He could not finish his adjuration, but fell at once into a state of stupor. I laid him out with his head in the shade, and his feet among the nettles. His respiration, now fast, now slowed and impeded, terrified me. And the mysterious communication just made to me by this man, the conviction that his soul had crossed boundless space in less than a second, inspired me with a sort of mysterious dread, as if an unknown world lay discovered before me. I felt myself grow pale, my fingers were restless, and trembled as if I had no control over them. The vital fluid penetrated the ends of my hair. Besides which a midday's heat concentrated between these old buildings the fetid exhalations from the neighboring bog, the croaking of the 2 frogs which had just begun their dismal duet in the green slime, the hum of thousands of insects, and you can understand what gloomy ideas succeeded one another in my mind till evening. Sometimes I looked at Wieland's pale face, covered with moisture, and I cannot describe the terror which then seized me. I seemed to be an accomplice in some frightful crime, and in spite of my promises I shook the sleeper with all my strength, but his body remained either motionless or fell in another direction. During these long hours it happened to me to meditate in my turn on these mysteries of Mithras. I said to myself that no doubt the first step of initiation would be the comprehension of animal life. The second, the essence and the functions of the soul. The third, God. But what man could have the audacity to seek, to taste uncreated might, or the pride to dare to explain it? Time passed on as I sat thinking. It was only at the close of day, when the church clock of Saint Etienne du Mont struck 8, that I went home to take some hours' repose. I had no doubt whatever that Hans Wieland's lethargic sleep would last tranquilly until the next day. In fact, the next morning about 6, having gone to see him, I found him in the same attitude, and his respiration seemed to me to be easier. Well, my friends, I can only tell you that day and the following night were passed in the same meditations and anxieties as the preceding. At the close of the second day, about 6 in the evening, feeling worn out with fatigue and inanition, I hurried to St. Benoit's to seek some refreshment. I remained at Master Ober's restaurant until 7. On my return, through the Rue Clovis, I fancied someone was following me, but when I turned round I was surprised at seeing no one. Though day was closing in, a most oppressive heat oppressed the silent city. Not a door was open to catch the first cool air of the evening. Not a soul was visible in the street. No stir, no noise betrayed any signs of life in the vast quarter of the Jardin des Plantes. Having quickened my steps, I was soon at the door of the enclosure, which, as I pressed it with my hand, opened without noise, and I was just moving through the grass towards the shed when Hans Wieland, paler than death, rushed to meet me, exclaiming, "Save yourself, Christian! Save yourself!" I was pushed back into the street. "Come, come!" he continued, calling out. "Hide yourself!" Old Madame Gentil hurried to the door of her house, screaming for help, thinking Wieland was going to rob me. But he pushed her aside with his elbow, and hurrying into the passage with me, burst into a fit of diabolical laughter. "Ha ha! The old woman shall pay for you. Come upstairs, Christian. Quick! The monster is in the street already. I feel it." I rushed upstairs, 4 at a time, as if the spectre of death was already behind me, and was extending its claws to seize me. The door of my room flew open and was closed upon us, while I fell into my armchair as if paralyzed. "My God, my God!" cried I, holding my hands crossed over my face. "What is the matter? How horrible all this is!" "The matter," replied Wieland coldly, "is that I have just returned from afar. I have accomplished 6,000 leagues in 2 days. I come from the banks of the Ganges, Christian, and I bring a charming fellow traveler back with me. Listen to what is going on in the street." I listened, and heard a crowd of people coming down the Rue Copeau, and then a confused rumor. At that moment my eyes met those of Hans. They were lighted up with an infernal expression of joy and satisfaction. "It is the blue cholera," he whispered. "The dreaded blue cholera." Then with more animation he continued. "From the tops of Mount Abuji, above the green-tufted palms, pomegranates, and tamarinds, at the bottom of the valley through which the Ganges flows, I saw it float slowly along, seated on a carcass, surrounded by vultures. I made a sign to it. It came. See, it has begun its work." A sort of fascination compelled me to look into the street. A laboring man with naked shoulders was carrying a woman along, her head hanging down and her legs dragging on the ground. As he passed beneath my window, followed by a crowd of people, I saw the poor creature's face was of a bluish tint. She was quite young and had just been seized with cholera. I turned round, shuddering from head to foot. Hans Wieland had disappeared. That very day, without delaying to pack up my effects, and only taking the precaution to carry with me sufficient money for my journey, I ran to the office of the Messageries in the Rue Notre-Dame de Victoire. A diligence was about to start for Strasbourg. I got into it as a drowning man clings to a plank. We set off. People were laughing and singing in the streets. No one as yet knew anything of the arrival of cholera in France. At every stage I leaned out of the window and inquired, "Is the cholera here?" And everyone laughed at me. "The poor fellow is crazy," said my fellow travelers. It was fearfully hot, but when 3 days later I had the happiness of throwing myself into the arms of Uncle Zacharias, and half dead with terror, I related all these strange occurrences to him. He listened gravely to what I said, and then replied, "My dear Christian, you have done well to come home. Very well indeed. Look at this newspaper. 1,200 deaths already. It is a fearful thing." End of section 5. Section 6 of Stories of the Rhine by Erckmann-Chatrian. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. The Raven's Requiem. 1. My uncle Zacharias was certainly the oddest original I ever saw in my life. Imagine to yourself a short, stout man with a fresh color, with a stomach like a wineskin, and a rubicund nose. That is the portrait of my uncle Zacharias. The worthy was quite bald. He generally wore large round spectacles, and on his head a small black silk cap, which hardly covered the back of his head. My dear uncle loved laughing. He also loved a tuffed turkey, pâté de foie gras, and old Johannesburg, but music he preferred to everything. Zacharias Mueller had been born a musician by the grace of God, as others are born French or Russian. He played on all instruments with a wonderful facility. His simple, good-natured air would never lead one to suppose how much gaiety, animation, and fancy such a personage could possess. God created the nightingale greedy, curious, and melodious. My uncle was the nightingale. He was always invited to every wedding, to all parties, baptisms, and funerals. "Master Zacharias," they used to say, "we want a hop, sir, an Alleluia or a Requiem for such and such a day." And he would simply reply, "You shall have it." Then he would sit down to work and whistle at his music stand, then smoke his pipe while a shower of notes rained down on the paper as he beat time with his left foot. Uncle Zacharias and I lived in an old house in the Rue de Menezingers at Tübingen. He inhabited the ground floor, quite a repository of curiosities, encumbered with ancient furniture and old musical instruments, while I slept in a room upstairs, and all the rest of the house was uninhabited. Dr. Haselnoss lived just opposite to us. In the evening, when my room was dark and the doctor's windows were lighted up, by a force of looking at them, it seemed to me that his lamp was getting nearer and nearer, and at last touched my face. I could see the profile of Haselnoss, moving about at the same time on the wall in a strange sort of way, his pigtail bobbing about right and left, his rat's head covered with his cocked hat, his coat with wide skirts, and his slender body perched upon 2 skinny legs. I could distinguish 2 glass cases full of strange animals, and glittering stones in the recesses of his apartment, and the backs of his books with gilt bindings, arranged on the shelves of his bookcase. Next to my uncle, Dr. Haselnoss was the greatest original in the town. Urschel, his housekeeper, boasted she only had a washing going on once every 6 months, and I can willingly believe it, for the doctor's shirts were stained with yellow spots, which proved what a quantity of linen he had shut up in his clothes-press. But the greatest peculiarity in the character of Haselnoss was that no cat or dog which had the mischance to cross his threshold ever was seen again. The Lord only knows what became of them. Public rumor even accused him of carrying a piece of bacon in one of the pockets of his coat in order to attract the poor animals. But when he went out in the morning to visit his patients and he trotted past my uncle's house, I could not help looking at his large pockets and the wide coat skirts with a vague feeling of fear. Such are the liveliest of my infantile impressions, but what charms me still in these distant souvenirs, which oftener than any other recur to my mind when I dream about dear Tübingen, is Hans, the raven, hovering about the streets, pilfering from the butcher's stalls, introducing himself into houses, stealing papers, and who was admired and petted by everyone, who was continually calling out, "Hans, come here! Hans, go there!" In truth, he was a strange bird. One day he made his appearance in the town with a broken wing. Dr. Haselnoss set it for him, and the whole population adopted him. One gave him meat, another cheese. Hans belonged to the whole place. He was under public protection. I liked Hans very much, though he used to peck at me with his great beak. I seem to see him now, hopping about in the snow, throwing his head aside to look at you maliciously out of the corner of his black eye. If you let anything fall out of your pocket, a kreutzer, a key, or what-not, Hans would pounce upon it and carry it off to the roof of the church. There it was he had his store. There he concealed the produce of his robberies, for Hans was unfortunately a thievish bird. Now Uncle Zacharias could not bear Hans. He said the inhabitants of Tübingen were fools to attach themselves to such a creature, and this man, generally so quiet and gentle, used to break out into fury if by chance his eyes fell upon the raven flying about before our windows. Now, one fine October evening, Uncle Zacharias seemed gayer than usual. He had not seen Hans all day. The windows were open, and the pleasant rays of the sun penetrated into the room. In the distance, autumn displayed her richest tints, which stood out gloriously against the dark green foliage of the firs. Uncle Zacharias was leaning back in his capacious armchair, and quietly smoking his pipe, while I watched him, and wondered what could make him smile, for his jolly red face was radiant with satisfaction. "My dear Tobias," said he, emitting a spiral column of smoke, "you cannot imagine what a sweet sensation of repose has just come over me. I've not felt myself so in tune to undertake some great work for many years, something in the style of Haydn's creation. The heavens seem to open before me. I can hear the angels and seraphim chanting their celestial hymn. I can even distinguish the different voices. What a grand composition, Tobias! A grand composition! If you could only hear the bass of the 12 apostles, it is magnificent, magnificent. Little Raphael's soprano pierces the clouds. You might say it was the trumpet on the day of judgment. Little angels are fluttering about, and the saints are weeping in the most harmonious manner. Hush! Now comes the Veni Creator. The colossal bass advances. The earth trembles. God is about to appear. And Master Zacharias bent his head and seemed to listen with all his soul. "Bene, Raphael, bene," he murmured. But while my uncle was thus plunged in ecstasy, and his face, his look, and his attitude expressed the most rapt attention, down comes Hans, and perches on our window-sill, giving utterance to a most lamentable quack. I saw Uncle Zacharias grow pale. He gave a look of terror at the window. His mouth was open, and his hand was stretched out in an attitude of stupefied astonishment. The raven, as I said before, had perched on the window-sill. I never saw such an expression of mockery before. His great beak was turned a little on one side, and his eye was as bright as a pearl. He uttered another ironical quack, and then began dressing his wing with his beak. My uncle never said a word. He seemed petrified. Hans took flight again, and Master Zacharias turned and looked at me for some seconds. "Did you recognize him?" he began. "Who?" "The devil, to be sure." "The devil? You are joking." But Uncle Zacharias did not condescend to answer me, and fell into a fit of deep thought. It was night. The sun had disappeared behind the firs of the Black Forest. From that day forward, Zacharias entirely lost all his good spirits. He first tried to commit his grand symphony of the seraphim to paper, and failing in that, he became very melancholy, lay stretched in his armchair with his eyes turned up to the ceiling, and did nothing but dream about the celestial harmony of his imagination. When I represented to him that our money was running short, and that he had better compose a waltz or a hopser or something else to keep us going. "A waltz! A hopser!" cried he. "What can you be thinking about? If you were to talk to me about my grand symphony, well and good, but a waltz! Look here, Tobias, you have lost your head. You don't know what you are talking about." Then he continued in a calmer tone. "Believe me, Tobias, as soon as I shall have completed my grand work, we can fold our arms and sleep as long as we like. It is the alpha and the omega of harmony. Our reputation will be made. I should have finished this chef d'oeuvre long ago, but for one thing only which hinders me. That raven." "The raven? But my dear uncle, how can the raven prevent your writing? Let me ask, is it not a bird like all other birds?" "Like all other birds?" muttered my indignant uncle.
I see, Tobias, you are in a conspiracy with the rest of my enemies. And yet what have I not done for you? Have I not brought you up as my own child? Have I not been a father and a mother to you? Have I not taught you to play the clarinet? Ah, Tobias, Tobias, it is very wrong of you. He spoke in such a tone of conviction that I ended by believing him. And in my heart I cursed Hans, who was such an obstacle to my uncle's inspiration. Were it not for him, said I to myself, our fortune would be made. And I began to doubt whether the raven was not the devil in person, as my uncle asserted. Sometimes Zacharias tried to put pen to paper, but by a curious and almost incredible fatality, Hans either showed himself at the critical moment, or we could hear his hoarse cry. Then the poor man would throw down his pen in despair, and had he possessed any hair, he would have torn it out by handfuls. His exasperation was so great. Things came to such a pitch that Master Zacharias borrowed the gun of Razer, the baker, a rusty old tinderbox, and mounted guard behind the door to watch for the accursed bird. But Hans, who was as cunning as the devil, ceased coming. And as soon as my uncle, who was shivering with cold, for it was in winter, went to warm his hands, Hans would come and croak just in front of the house. Master Zacharias would rush into the street. Hans was just out of sight. It was quite a comedy. The whole town talked about it. My schoolfellows turned my uncle into ridicule, and consequently I had more than one fight in the square. I stood up for him stoutly, and I generally went home in the evening with a black eye or a swollen nose. Then he would look affectionately at me and say, "Keep up your courage, my dear boy. In a little while you shall not have such a hard time of it." And then he set to work describing with enthusiasm the grand work he was meditating. It was really superb. It was all arranged. First the overture of the Apostles, then the chorus of the Seraphim in a B and E flat, then the Veni Creator, accompanied by thunder and lightning. "But," added my uncle, "that raven must die. The raven is the cause of all the mischief. Do you see, Tobias? Were it not for him, my grand symphony would have been finished long ago, and we should now be living on our property." One evening I was going home in the dusk, and in the little square I met Hans. It had been snowing, the moon was shining above the roofs of the houses, and a vague feeling of uneasiness came over me when I perceived the raven. When I reached our house, I was very much surprised to find the door open. There was a gleam of light in the windows, like the reflection of a fire nearly extinct. I went in and called out. No answer. But judge my astonishment when, by the light of the fire, I saw my uncle, with his nose blue and his ears violet, stretched at full length in his armchair, our neighbor's old gun between his legs, and his shoes covered with snow. The poor man had again been trying to shoot Hans. I called out, "Uncle Zacharias, are you asleep?" He half opened his eyes, and, fixing a dull look on me, said, "Tobias, I've aimed at him more than 20 times, but he always disappeared just as I was going to pull the trigger." And then he relapsed into his state of torpor. It was in vain that I shook him. I could not make him move. Then I became frightened, and ran across the street for Hasselnoss. As I raised the knocker, my heart was beating fearfully, and as the blow sounded along the passage, my knees bent under me. The street was empty. Snowflakes were falling all around me, and I shivered. At the third knock, the doctor's window opened, and Hasselnoss put out his head, covered with the cotton nightcap. "Who is there?" cried a shrill voice. "Come as quick as you can to see Master Zacharias. He is very ill." "I will put on my coat and come directly," replied Hasselnoss. The window was closed. I waited there a long quarter of an hour, looking up and down the deserted street, listening to the weathercocks creaking on their rusty pivots, and some distant farmyard dog baying the moon. At last I heard steps, and gently, gently, someone crept downstairs. A key was inserted in the lock, and Hasselnoss appeared on the threshold wrapped up in a gray cloak, with a small lantern in his hand.
"Brr," he began. "How cold it is! I was right to wrap myself well up."
"Yes," replied I. "I have been shivering here for 20 minutes.
I made haste not to keep you waiting."
A minute later we were in my uncle's room.
"Good evening, Master Zacharias," said the doctor as quietly as possible, while he blew out his lantern. "How do you find yourself? It seems you have a little cold in the head."
When he heard the doctor's voice,
Uncle Zacharias seemed to awake. "Doctor," said he, "I will tell you the whole story from the beginning." "It is not worthwhile," began Hasselnoss, sitting down opposite him on an old trunk. "I know all about it better than you. I know the principle and its consequences, the cause and its effects. You detest Hans, and Hans detests you. You run after him with a gun, and Hans comes and perches on your windowsill to laugh at you. Ha ha! It's very plain the raven does not like the song of the nightingale, and the nightingale cannot bear the raven's cry." After this speech, Hasselnoss helped himself to a pinch from his little snuff-box. Then he crossed his legs, shook his shirt-frill, and began to smile while he fixed his cunning little eyes on Zacharias. My uncle was aghast. "Listen," Hasselnoss went on. "What I have just said ought not to surprise you. Every day the same thing occurs. Our poor world is ruled by sympathies and antipathies. Go into a tavern or a brewery, no matter where, look at two men playing cards. Without being acquainted with either of them, you cannot help taking more interest in one than the other. What reason can you give for your preference? None. And on that fact, philosophers construct systems farther than we can follow them, instead of saying at once, 'Here is a cat, and there is a mouse. I feel for the mouse because we belong to the same family, because before I was Hasselnoss, Doctor of Medicine, I was a rat, a squirrel, or a dormouse, and consequently—' He did not finish his sentence, for at that moment my uncle's cat chancing to pass close to him, the doctor seized him by the neck and made him disappear in his big pocket as quick as lightning. Uncle Zacharias and I looked at him in stupid amazement. "What are you going to do with my cat?" my uncle began. But Hasselnoss, instead of answering his question, smiled with an air of constraint and muttered, "Master Zacharias, I can cure you." "In the first place, give me my cat back." "If," replied Hasselnoss, "you force me to restore your cat, I leave you to your fate. You shall not have a moment's peace. You shall be unable to write a note of music, and every day you shall grow thinner and thinner." "But in the name of heaven," cried my uncle, "what harm has the poor animal done to you?" "What harm?" cried the doctor, whose features suddenly contracted. "What harm? Know we have been in a state of warfare for ages and ages. Know that the cat contains in himself the quintessence of the thistle, which choked me when a violet, of the holly which kept thou from sun from me when a bush, of the pike which swallowed me when a carp, and of the sparrowhawk which devoured me when I was a mouse." I thought Hasselnoss going mad, but my uncle closed his eyes, and after a long silence replied, "I understand you, Dr. Hasselnoss. I understand you. Maybe you are not far wrong. Cure me, then, and I surrender my cat." The doctor's eyes sparkled. "That is the way to put it," cried he. "Now I shall set about curing you." He took a penknife out of his instrument case and picked up a little bit of wood from the hearth, which he split in two with great dexterity, while my uncle and I watched him. After splitting the bit of wood, he picked out the pith. Then he took a very narrow strip of parchment out of his pocketbook, and having fitted it between the two slips of wood, he put it to his lips and smiled. My uncle's face brightened up. "Dr. Hasselnoss," he exclaimed, "you are an uncommon man, a really superior man, a man—" "I know it," interrupted Hasselnoss. "I know it, but put out the light and don't let there be a spark of fire to be seen." While I carried his directions into execution, he threw the window wide open. The night was bitterly cold. The calm and limpid moon shone above the roofs. The dazzling whiteness of the snow formed a strange contrast with the profound darkness of the room. I could distinguish the profiles of my uncle and Hasselnoss at the window. Many strange sensations at once had possession of me. Uncle Zacharias sneezed. Hasselnoss raised his hand impatiently to enforce silence. All at once a shrill whistle seemed to traverse the obscurity. "By white! By white!" After this cry, all was silent again. I could hear my heart beat. In another instant the same whistle was heard. "By white! By white!" And I knew it was the doctor's call. This discovery gave me a little courage, and I paid closer attention than before to what was going on round me. Uncle Zacharias, half stooping down, was looking at the moon. Hasselnoss stood perfectly still, one hand on the window, and the other holding the call. Perhaps 2 or 3 minutes might have elapsed when I suddenly heard the clap of a bird's wings.
"Oh," muttered Zacharias. "Hush," began Hasselnoss, and the pie white was repeated several times in curiously modulated tones. The restless bird twice brushed past the window in his rapid flight. Uncle Zacharias made a motion to seize his gun, but Hasselnoss took hold of his arm and murmured, "Are you mad?" Then my uncle checked himself, and the doctor skillfully repeated his cry, imitating the scream of the shrike when caught in a snare with such dexterity that Hans, who had been eddying about the house, at last flew into the room, no doubt attracted by the curiosity which seemed his ruling passion. I heard his claws fall on the board. Uncle Zacharias gave a shout and ran after the bird, which escaped from his hands. "How awkward you are," said Hasselnoss as he shut the window. All this time Hans was fluttering about the ceiling, and after making the circuit of the room 5 or 6 times, he dashed against the glass with such force that he fell stunned on the ledge with his claws caught in the curtains. Hasselnoss soon lighted a candle, and I saw poor Hans in my uncle's hands, who was squeezing his neck with all his might in a frenzy of enthusiasm, saying at the same time, "I've got you at last! I've got you!" Hasselnoss laughed as loudly as my uncle. "Ha ha! You seem satisfied, Master Zacharias. Satisfied at last, ha ha!" I never saw a more frightful scene. My uncle's face was crimson. The poor bird stretched out his legs, fluttered his wings like a great night moth, while the death shiver ruffled his plumes. The spectacle horrified me, and I ran to hide myself at the end of the room. When my uncle's first emotions of gratified vengeance were over, he became himself again. "Tobias," said he, "the devil has had his due, and I forgive him. Hold that Hans up before my eyes that I may look at him. Ah, I feel I breathe again. Now, silence and listen." And Master Zacharias, with inspiration on his face, gravely seated himself at his piano. I was standing opposite him, holding the bird by the beak. Behind him, Hasselnoss was holding the candle, and it would not have been possible to see a more grotesque picture than that offered by Hans, Zacharias, and Hasselnoss under the somber and worm-eaten beams of the ceiling. I can see them still lighted up by the uncertain flickering of the candle, as well as our furniture, the shadow of which quivered on the crazy walls. At the first chords, my uncle seemed transformed. His large blue eyes glistened with enthusiasm. He was no longer playing before us, but in a cathedral, before some immense assemblage in the presence of God himself. What a sublime song, in turn solemn, pathetic, harrowing, and resigned. Then, in the midst of sobs, hope, displaying her wings of azure and gold. How is it possible to conceive such grand ideas? It was a requiem, and for a whole hour my uncle Zacharias's inspiration never failed him. Hasselnoss laughed no more. His face had insensibly put on a very strange expression. I thought he was affected, but I soon noticed him making a curious motion with his hands and squeezing them together, and I saw something was struggling in his coat skirts. When my uncle, exhausted by so much excitement, leaned his forehead on the edge of the piano, the doctor took the cat, which he had strangled, out of his pocket. "Ha ha!" he said. "Good night, Master Zacharias. Good night. We have each of us our prey. Ha ha! You have composed a requiem for Hans the Raven, and now you may compose an Alleluia for your cat. Good night." My uncle was so worn out that he merely nodded to the doctor and motioned me to see him out. Now that very night died the Grand Duke Yari Peter, second of the name, and as Hasselnoss was crossing the street, I heard the cathedral bells slowly beginning to toll. When I returned to the room, I found my uncle Zacharias standing up. "Tobias," said he gravely, "go to bed, my child. I am quite well again. I must put all this to paper this night, lest I should forget it." About 9 the next morning I was awakened by a great disturbance. The whole town was in a commotion, and they talked of nothing but the Grand Duke's death. Master Zacharias was sent for to the castle. They ordered him to compose Yari Peter's Requiem, a work which was worth to him the post of bandmaster, which had so long been the object of his ambition.
So Uncle Zacharias became a great personage, since he had $1,000 a year to spend, and he often used to whisper to me, "Ah, nephew, if they only knew it was for the Raven that I composed my famous Requiem, we might still be going about playing the clarionet at village fairs." And my uncle's fat sides shook with satisfaction. And so things happen in this world. End of section 6. Section 7 of Stories of the Rhine by Erckmann-Chatrian. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. The Song of the Tun. I was sitting the other evening between 10 and 11 in the Taverne des Escargots at Nuremberg. I was quietly and contentedly watching the crowd moving about under the low beams of the public room, and all along the oaken tables, and I felt happy that I was in existence. What a row of jolly faces! Some fat, some red, grave, gay, sneering, contented, lovelorn, some winking their eyes, some raising their elbows, gaping, snoring, fidgeting, sprawling their legs out, their hats on their ears, their cocked hats stuck on the backs of their heads. It was a sight worth looking at. They were thundering out the hymn from the brigands, "I am the king of these mountains." Their voices were all united in one vast harmony. Even little Christian Schmidt, who was sitting on his father's knee, contributed his part of the soprano in a most satisfactory manner. I nodded my head. I kept time with my foot. I hummed first one air and then another. And of course I attributed the success of the music in a great measure to my own exertions. I turned my eyes just then in the direction where Sebald Brouwer, the tavern keeper, was sitting behind his counter. It was about the time when Brouwer began to grow funny. His left cheek was puffed out, his right eye closed. He spoke in a whisper, and his cotton nightcap was pushed onto the back of his rusty old wig. Sebald was looking at me, too. "Ha!" said he, lifting up his finger mysteriously. "Do you hear, Theodore?" "Hear what?" "My Brownsburg singing, to be sure." "Oh, you simpleton!" exclaimed I. "Oh, man with a purely metaphysical mind without the least practical sense! How can you suppose that your wine sings? If you were to say that the drunkards who have been swilling it sang, well and good. I could understand you then. But that wine... Really, Sebald, your ideas are quite ridiculous, not to say illogical." But Sebald was not listening to me. He was passing from one table to another, with his leather apron tucked up round his waist, serving his customers, and spilling half the contents of his jugs over them, but calm and dignified. Fat old Orchel took his place behind the counter with a sigh. The 6 lamps began to dance about the roof. When I had been for a quarter of an hour trying in vain to explain that extraordinary phenomenon, Brouwer suddenly stumbled up against me, exclaiming, "Theodore, the barrel is empty. Come down to the cellar and help me to fill it. You will see strange things there." I knew that Brouwer owns the finest cellar in Nuremberg, next to that belonging to the Grand Duke, the cellar of the old Benedictine convent. So you may guess how readily I accepted his offer. Sebald had already a lighted candle in his hand. We walked off arm in arm, our sabots resounding on the floor, waving our arms about and shouting with our heads up, "I am the king of these mountains." People about us laughed at us, and some said, "Ah, the rascals, how pleased they seem." When we were in the Rue des Escargots, we became quieter. The night was damp. The ruinous old houses seemed ready to fall on our heads. The misty moon let drop a silvery thread from her distaff, which wound along the zigzag course of the gutter. And at a distance I heard a cat beating his wife, who uttered the most plaintive cries. "Brr," said Sebald, shivering. "It's very cold." At the same time he raised the heavy trap door, which was fixed slanting-wise against the narrow wall, and began to descend the stairs. I followed him slowly. The stairs seemed as if we never should reach the bottom. Our shadows grew longer and longer behind us. I caught myself several times looking back in surprise. I noticed Brouwer's enormous square-built frame, his brown neck covered with short curly hair down to his shoulders, and a strange idea came into my head. I fancied I saw the Benedictine's butler before me, going to visit the convent library. I supposed myself to be one of that ancient brotherhood, and I passed my hand across my breast in search of a venerable beard. At the bottom of the stairs, a niche cut in the thickness of the wall vaguely recalled the statue of the Virgin to my mind, before which, in olden times, a light was burning constantly. Very much impressed and almost frightened as I was about to impart my doubts on the subject to Sebald, when an enormous door made of heart of oak and covered with large, flat-headed nails stopped our farther progress. The tavern keeper gave it a shove with all his strength and exclaimed, "Here we are, comrade!" His voice rolled away through the subterranean darkness like distant thunder. I had the most curious sensations. We went in gravely and seriously. I have visited many celebrated cellars in the course of my life, from that of Jari Peter, our glorious ruler, to the cellars of the town hall at Bremen, where the famous Rosenwein wine is kept, a bottle of which the burghers of the good free town used to send to Gotha every year on his birthday. I have seen larger cellars and richer and high-class wines, but truth compels me to acknowledge I have never seen any so clean and kept in such perfect order. The casks were arranged in 2 parallel lines under an arch 30 feet high, and about 100 yards long. They had a look of respectability which was very pleasant to see. Behind every barrel a placard was hanging to the wall indicating the growth, the year, the day and month of the vintage, whether of the first or second pressing. In fact, all the titles of nobility which the generous juice, enclosed in those long iron-bound staves, was entitled to claim. We walked along with slow and solemn steps. "This is Braunsberg," said the tavern keeper, holding up the light before a colossal cask. "This is my common wine. Listen how he is singing up there. It is for me the miser piles his golden crown's reflected light. It is for me the maiden smiles in gloomy hut or parlor bright. Ah, the villain, how he turns up his ruddy mustache." So spoke Brouwer, and we moved on. "Halt!" he exclaimed. "Here we are at 1822 Steinberg. Grandier, taste that." He put the light down, took from the tap a bohemian open-lipped wine glass with a thin stem, and turned the cock. A golden thread filled the glass. Before handing it to me, Brouwer raised it gently to show its beautiful pale amber color. Then he put it under his hooked nose. "What a bouquet it has," said he. "What perfume! This is pure imagination. It is the dream in the Frischholz." I drank. Every fiber in my brain seemed electrified. I was dazzled. "Well," said Sebald. In answer, I began to hum Intrepid Hunter. And the distant echoes replied. They rose out of the obscurity and sang with me. It was magnificent. "You did not sing just now," said Sebald with a strange smile. This made me reflect. I stopped short and exclaimed, "Do you believe, then, that the wine sings?" But he did not seem to pay any attention to my words. He had become very serious. We continued our subterranean peregrinations. The old casks seemed to wait our coming with respect. Our looks became more animated. Brouwer drank too. "Aha!" said he. "This is the opera of the magic flute. You must be a great friend of mine for me to play you an air of this. Yes, indeed. Johannesburg of the year 11. An almost imperceptible thread seemed to whistle into the cup. The glass was full. I drank the very last drop and meditated over it with respect. Brouwer was watching my face with his hands crossed behind his back. He seemed to envy my good fortune. As for me, the spirit of the old wine more lively than our own, the spirit which inspired Mozart, Gluck, Weber, and Theodor Hoffmann, invaded my being and made my hair stand on end. "Oh, inspiration divine!" cried I. "Oh, enchanting music! No, never was mortal raised to the invisible spheres as I have been." I ogled the melodious cask from out of the corner of my eye, but Brouwer did not think fit to play me a second tune on it. "Good," he began. "When one does commit an extravagance, it is as well to do it for a man of real appreciation, a true artist. You are not like Kalb,
our burgomaster, who wanted to tickle his throat with a second and even with a third glass before he could venture to give an opinion upon it. The beast! I turned him out of the cellar. Then we passed in review Steinberg, Holtenheim, Hochheim, Marcobrunner, Rudsheimer, and all exquisite wines and generous, and strangely enough, at every fresh wine some different new air came into my head. I hummed it involuntarily, and Sebalt's idea became more intelligible. I comprehended he wanted to give me an experimental lesson on the greatest problem of modern times. "Brouwer," I said to him, "do you seriously believe that a man is but the passive instrument of the bottle? A bugle, for instance, or a flute, or a cornet à piston, merely a mouthpiece to the barrel, and whence it derives its music? What would become of liberty, moral law, individual and social reason, if this be true? We should be merely funnels, a sort of conscienceless and undignified machine. The Emperor Wenceslas, the greatest drunkard ever known, would then have been the only one capable of comprehending what human destiny really is. Is he to be set above Solon or Lycurgus or the 7 wise men of Greece?" "Not only do I believe it," replied Brouwer, "but I am sure of it. Those idiots who are making that noise up above think they are singing of their own free will. Now, on the contrary, it is I who select here in my cellar the air which I like best. Every cask, every barrel, has its own favorite air. One grave, another gay, another sad or melancholy. You shall judge for yourself, Theodore. For your sake I will sacrifice a small cask of Hochheim. It is a very delicate wine. The Braunsberg ought to be nearly gone, for they are making a fearful noise at the tavern. You will give them a sentimental turn." So instead of filling his little barrel with Braunsberg, he set it under the tap of Hochheim. Then he very adroitly hoisted it up on his shoulders, and we left the cellar. The tavern was in an uproar. The brigand's hymn had degenerated scandalously. "Oh," cried Sebalt's wife, "how you have kept me waiting! Every bottle has been empty for the last quarter of an hour. Just listen to the noise. They will break everything." We could hear the bottles rolled about upon the tables, to the cry of "Wine! More wine!" The tavern keeper set his barrel on the counter and filled the bottles. His wife had hardly time to serve them, and the cries and yells were louder than ever. I regained my seat and looked on at the riot which was going on, while I hummed the airs from the magic flute, the Frischschutz, Don Giovanni, Oberon, and I know not how many operas, which I have either long since forgotten or which I have never known. Youth, love, poetry, family, happiness, hopes without limits, all grew young again in my heart. I laughed. In fact, I was beside myself. All at once a profound calm succeeded. The air from the brigands ceased as if by enchantment. The fiddler's daughter, Julia Weber, began singing the sweet, tender air of the maiden from the opera of Frederick Barbarossa. "Maiden on the plain so drear, whither so early say? I go to the Sunday's mass to hear, at the village far away. Hark, the bell calls me, like the lamb which bleats impatient round its dam." The whole room listened to the young girl, observing a religious silence, and when she ceased, all those great, coarse, fat faces began murmuring, "Hark, the bell calls me like the lamb which bleats impatient round its dam." It had quite a theatrical effect. "Well," said Brouwer, whispering in my ear, "what has been singing now?" "The cask of Hochheim has been singing," I replied in a low tone, as I listened to the girl who had begun to sing again some tender, old-fashioned air of the good old times. "O noble slopes of the Gironde, illustrious vineyards of Burgundy, of the Rheingau, and you too, fiery vines of Spain and Italy, Madeira, Marsala, Port, Sherry, Lagrima Christi, and you also, Tokay, generous Hungarian, I know your merits now. You are the spirit of past times, of extinct generations. I wish you well with all my heart. May you flourish and prosper for all time, and you, kind captives in your bonds of ash and iron, you are impatiently waiting the happy moment of passing into our veins, of causing our hearts to beat, of living again in us. Well, you will not wait long. I swear to deliver you, and let you sing and laugh as long as the Creator of all beings entrusts me with this noble mission. But when I am no longer here, when my bones have grown green as knotty vine stems on the hillside, when my blood boils in crimson drops in the ripened grape, and pours forth from the winepress in limpid streams, then, young men, your turn it becomes to deliver me then. Let me revive in you, be your strength, your joy, your courage, as your ancestors are mine today. That is all I ask of you, and by so doing we shall all, each in his turn, fulfill the sublime precept, love one another forever and ever. Amen. End of section 7.
Section 8 of Stories of the Rhine by Erckmann-Chatrian. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Citizen Schneider. How comes it that the recollections of our childhood are so deeply rooted? Said Friedrich the sculptor, lighting his pipe with a melancholy air. When we can scarcely remember the events which happened last month, how comes it that the scenes of our youth are engraved, as it were, on our memory, so that we can fancy sometimes that we are still living in the midst of them? I shall never forget, for instance, my father's humble cabin, with its thatched roof, its little low living room, the wooden staircase at the back, which led up to the attic, the bed with its gray serge curtains, and the 2 small windows with leaded panes which looked out on the mountain pass of the Schlaucht, near Munster. These things I never can forget, nor the most insignificant events of these days either. Everything seems vividly impressed on my memory, but especially the winter of 1785. During this winter, Grandfather Yeri, with his great frizzy woolen cap pulled down over his ears, slept from morning till night in the old easy-chair beside the hearth. My mother plied her spinning-wheel, and my father carved heads for walking-sticks out of holly. The shavings fell thick beside him on the ground as he worked, curling themselves into what seemed to me like snail shells. Sometimes he stopped to rest, struck a light with the flint and steel, and, pressing the lighted tinder on his pipe, cried out, "It's getting on, Catherine, it's getting on!" Then, seeing me sitting on my little stool, deeply attentive to what was going on, for I liked nothing so well as to watch him at work, he smiled at me and resumed his task. The snow rose higher and higher every day about our cabin. Already the old tottering walls were hidden from view. It was only through the upper panes of the windows that we could catch a glimpse of the sky. The others were of a dull dead white. Sometimes I climbed up in a chair and gazed out at the clouds, sweeping in ever-changing shapes over the immense valley below. The rocky summit of the Hennick, rising into the heavens, and lower down the dark pine trees clothed with a silvery mantle of hoar frost. There was not a sign of life anywhere. The look of the landscape with its thick carpet of snow gave you a shuddering sense of cold, and yet, inside, the fire blazed brightly on the hearth, diffusing a pleasant warmth around. The little dilapidated door which communicated with the stables allowed us to hear the bleating of our goat and the deep lowing of our cow, Waldine. It was a pleasure to hear them, in the cold and desolation of such a winter. We felt that at least we were not alone amidst the snows. We were in the company of God's creatures. Although dumb animals, they were still friends. I shall never forget one morning that Waldine, who was no doubt tired of being kept so long in the dark, succeeded in slipping her head out of the stakes, in some way or other, and came in to pay us a visit. She walked into the room without the least embarrassment, and my father, seeing her, burst into a hearty laugh. "Hello! Good morning, Waldine!" cried he. "You come in without ever thinking of taking off your hat. Leave her alone, Catherine. Leave her alone. She'll not do any harm. Give her time to look about her and get a breath of fresh air." Then I was commissioned to take her back to the stable and make her fast to the rack. So the time went on, whilst day by day the birds dropped dead from cold and hunger, and the wild beasts took refuge in the caverns of Hennick and the Valtine. We, gathering close around the hearth, passed our days in a sort of dreamy repose, and every evening my mother used to say, "Another day over, another day nearer spring." All this that I have described I remember with delight. But there are strange and painful events sometimes happening in this world which come up before you long afterwards, and show that the wisdom of men, and even their kindness, is often nothing but folly. That year, then, on the last day of January, between 1 and 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a high wind rose. Although the house was sheltered from the north, it trembled at every blast. But in the course of an hour it was so covered with snow that the storm passed completely over it. We had put out the fire, and the only light in the house was from a lamp which we placed on the table. My mother was praying, and I think my father was also. Grandfather had waked up and seemed frightened at the noise. All the snow which had fallen for the last 30 months was whirling upwards to the sky in clouds. The howling and whistling and moaning of the storm outside was terrific. Every second or two we heard the crash of some gigantic tree torn up from its roots. If the wind had been in front of the house, it would have dashed in our windows and stripped off the roof in a twinkling. Fortunately, it blew from the mountain behind. In the midst of this frightful noise, we fancied sometimes we could distinguish the cries of human beings, and although so much alarmed for our safety, we could not help shuddering at the thought of fellow creatures being exposed to the fury of such a tempest. Every time these sounds reached our ears, Mother repeated, "There is someone out in the storm." And we listened with beating hearts, but the grand voice of the tempest drowned everything else. This lasted for 2 hours. Then there came a deep silence, and we heard our goat bleating again in the stable. "The wind is down," said my father, and approaching the door he listened for a few moments, with his finger on the latch. We were all close behind him when he opened it, and we gazed out with eager eyes. The sky was very dark on account of the snow which was falling. A white spot on our right showed the position of the sun. It might then have been about 4 o'clock. As we were looking steadfastly through the thick flakes, we perceived, about 200 or 300 yards below us, on the path leading down from the Schlaucht, a sleigh buried in the snow, with a horse attached to it. Nothing was visible but the horse's head and the raised points of the runners of the sleigh.
"That must have been what we heard,"
exclaimed Grandfather Yeri. "Yes," said my father, coming back into the cabin. "An accident has happened." He took the wooden shovel from behind the door and began to descend the hill, plunging into the snow up to his knees at every step. I ran close behind him, unheeding my mother's cries, and Grandfather followed too at a greater distance. The farther we went down, the deeper grew the snow. Notwithstanding that, my father, having reached the top of the sloping bank which bordered the road, slid down it, supporting himself by the handle of the shovel, while I remained above looking on at the proceedings. He caught the horse by the bridle to lead him forward, but immediately perceiving some object lying a few yards off in the snow, he went up to it, and found it was the body of a stout, middle-aged man, dressed in black. He lifted him up with a good deal of difficulty, his head falling heavily on his shoulder, and laid him in the sleigh. Then, by dint of shouting and pulling, he succeeded in getting the animal extricated from the hole into which he had fallen. It was a terrible affair to get the sleigh up to our house, but my father managed it by carefully making a circuit round the rocks and roots of trees where the snow lay the deepest. Grandfather and I followed close behind, feeling very sad, and gazing at the unfortunate man lying stretched on the sleigh. He had on a cassock, and wore black silk stockings and silver buckles in his shoes. He was evidently a priest. You may imagine the distress of my mother on seeing this holy man in such a pitiable plight. I fancied I can still hear her crying, with her hands clasped above her head, "Lord, have mercy upon us." She wanted to send my father off at once to Munster to fetch a doctor. But in the meantime, night had come on. It was as dark as pitch outside, and all the goodwill in the world won't enable you to find your way through the snow under such circumstances. In this sad state of affairs, all we could do was to light the fire as fast as possible, to warm the blankets and other wraps. And as during these operations I was in everyone's way, I was sent off to bed in grandfather's room. All night I heard the noise of people coming and going in the room below. I could see the light shining through the chinks in the floor, and heard my mother crying and lamenting. At last, towards 1 o'clock, worn out with fatigue and an empty stomach, I fell asleep, and slept so soundly that they had to awake me at 8 o'clock the following morning. Otherwise, I dare say I should be sleeping still. "Frederick, Frederick," cried grandfather, raising the trap-door with his bald head. "Frederick, come down, my child, the soup is ready." At the sound of this well-known voice, I awoke and looked round. It was broad daylight, and the delicious smell of the potato soup filled the whole house. I barely took time to slip on my little gray linen trousers and my sabots before going down. All the events of the evening before were vividly present to my mind, and besides being very hungry, I was curious to know what was going on. So while still at the top of the stairs, I leaned over the banisters and looked down eagerly into the room below. The soup tureen was smoking on a nice white tablecloth. Grandfather, who was sitting opposite, was making the sign of the cross. Father and mother were repeating the Benedicite, most devoutly standing, and the fat man, seated in a leather-covered armchair beside the hearth, with his legs wrapped in a woolen coverlet, and his hands crossed over his rounded paunch, which reminded one of the shape of a bagpipe, looked for all the world, with his fleshy face and red hair, like a cat sleeping on the warm wood ashes. It was touching to behold him.
"Come down, Friedrich," said my mother. "Don't be afraid. His Reverence, the curé, will not harm you."
The stout man turned his head round and said with a smile, "This is your little boy?"
"Yes, your Reverence."
"Come this way, my little lad," said he. My mother took me by the hand and led me up to the good priest, who looked at me with a softened expression in his great gray eyes. Then he tapped me on the cheek and asked, "Does he know his prayers yet?"
"Oh, yes, your Reverence. It was the first thing we taught him."
That's right, that's right." My mother had taken off my cap, and with my hands clasped, and my eyes fixed on the ground, I repeated the Ave Maria and Pater Noster without drawing breath. Very good indeed," said the stout man, pinching my ear. "You will one day be a good servant before the Lord. Go now and take your breakfast. I am pleased with you." He spoke so gently that the whole family thought, "What a good man, what a kind heart he has, what a sad thing if he had been frozen to death in the Schlaucht." But a circumstance happened which showed us this good man in quite a different light. You must know that my father, the evening before, had carried his Reverence the curé's baggage, consisting of his portmanteau, his three-cornered hat, and a thick roll of paper, into the house, and placed them on a great chest on the other side of the hearth, the portmanteau below, the three-cornered hat above, and the roll of papers lying on top of the hat. In passing round the table, I happened to touch the roll of papers, which fell on the floor and scattered all about the hearth. Then this quiet, peaceful man uttered a cry like that of a famished wolf, accompanied with a whole volley of frightful oaths. He threw himself on the papers, snatched them from the flames, and began to extinguish them with his hands. Then he looked at me, standing there pale and condemned, with such a ferocious air that I felt my flesh creep. We were all the picture of consternation, and gazed at him with open mouths. He, examining his papers, which were a little scorched at the edges, began to stammer out angrily, "My Thucydides! The little wretch! He nearly burned my Thucydides!" After which, rolling his papers up together, and perceiving our air of dismay and surprise, he shook his finger at me with an attempt to resume his former good-natured manner. But we were no longer in a humor to enjoy his jocularity. "Ah, you little rascal," said he, "you gave me a sad fright just now. Only imagine, I have come expressly from Cologne about these papers. Yes, I have traveled more than 300 miles to search for these old manuscripts in the convent of St. Die. It took me 3 months to put them into some sort of order, and here is the carelessness of this unfortunate child on the point of annihilating a work which is perhaps the only one of the kind in the world. I'm all in a perspiration with fright." It was quite true. His broad fat face was purple with agitation, and the great drops of sweat were standing on his forehead. Notwithstanding that, you may easily imagine that we all looked very grave. We were not accustomed to hear priests swearing like a pack of cattle drivers. My mother did not say a word. We ate our breakfast in silence. When we had finished, Father went out. We heard him leading the horse from the stable and harnessing him to the sleigh in front of the door. Then he came in again and said, "Your Reverence, if you will take your seat in the sleigh, we shall be in Munster in an hour." "I am quite ready," said the fat man, rising, and looking round the room with a serious air, he added, "You are good worthy people. Forget my momentary hastiness. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Permit me to testify my gratitude towards you." He attempted to slip a gold Frederick into my mother's hand, but she refused, saying, "It was in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ that we gave assistance in time of distress, your Reverence. If we had been in need, you would have done the same for us." No doubt, said he. "But that shouldn't prevent me from—" "Oh, no, do not deprive us of the merit of doing a good deed." "Amen," said he abruptly. He took the roll of papers from the chest, put on his three-cornered hat, and went out. My father had already carried the portmanteau out to the sleigh, and had taken his seat on the bench in front. The curé got in behind, and we stood watching them as they drove off in the direction of the hollow rocks. We all felt thoughtful and serious. Grandfather frequently gave a silent look at my mother. A crowd of ideas were passing through our minds, but none of us said anything. In the evening, about 4 o'clock, my father returned. He said that he had driven the Cologne clergyman to the house of his Reverence the Curé of Munster, and that was all. That year the spring came on at the usual time. After 5 long months of winter, the sun's heat grew strong enough to melt the snows and dry the damp floors of our cabin. We put the cow and goat into the paddock, cleaned out the stable, and let in fresh air. Very soon I was driving the beasts to the pastures again, cracking my whip and making the mountains echo with my joyous shouts. The hillsides were once more covered with bloom, and the great storm was forgotten. 2. Several years passed away. Grandfather Yeri died, and my father sent me to Lower Alsace to serve my apprenticeship as a sculptor to my uncle Conrad at Wettenheim. I was now nearly 15 years of age and began to think myself a man. It was at the time when everyone wore the red cap and tricolored cockade, and men were setting out every day in hundreds, in gray linen trousers and with a musket on their shoulder. I remembered that at this time 2 regiments were being formed in Strasbourg, and they had to get children to beat the charge, as all the men insisted on carrying a musket. 5 boys presented themselves for this purpose at Wettenheim, of whom I was one. We drew lots who should go. It was a neighbor of ours, little Fritzl, on whom the lot fell, and the whole village cried out that he was in luck. Nowadays people think themselves lucky when they are left behind. It was at this time, too, that the Abbé Schneider was exterminating all the curés, monks, and canons in Alsace. Henceforward, nothing was to be worshipped but the goddess of reason and the graces. One morning I was busily engaged dressing a piece of freestone in our workshop, which looked into the little square with a fountain in the center. Uncle Conrad was standing at the door smoking his pipe, and Aunt Gretel was sweeping the chips of stone into the passage. It might have been about 10 o'clock when we heard a great noise outside. Men were running past in front of the house, others were crossing the square, and others again were following the crowd, asking, "What's this all about? What has happened?" Naturally, I dropped my work to see what was going on, but I had only got as far as the passage when the trot of a large body of horse was heard in the distance, together with the clashing of sabers and the heavy roll of a large wagon, and then the blast of a trumpet echoed through the village. The next moment a squadron of hussars wheeled into the square, those in front with cocked pistols held aloft, and the others with their naked sabers in their hands. Behind them, on a black horse, rode a stout man dressed in a blue coat, with broad lapels thrown back on the chest, an immense cocked hat with tricolored feathers worn across the head, a scarf round his middle, and a cavalry saber dangling against his boot. Then came, jolting heavily over the pavement, a great cart or wagon drawn by gray horses, and piled with red-colored beams of wood. The fat man with the tricolored plume was laughing, whilst the people, as pale as death, shrank up against the walls, their mouths wide open.
and their arms hanging down. At first glance I saw that it was the priest whom we had saved from the snow. A few hypocritical mountebanks in the crowd, in order to seem as if they had no cause for fear, were shouting, "Here comes Citizen Schneider to sweep the caterpillars out of Wettenheim in the neighborhood. Let the aristocrats look out!" Others were singing with all sorts of contortions, "The aristocrats to the lantern! The lantern! The lantern!" They kept moving their arms and legs up and down in time to the music, but that did not prevent their hearts from being in their shoes, like everyone else, and the laugh from being on the wrong side of the mouth. When opposite the fountain, the procession stopped. Schneider, cocking his nose up in the air, gave a look round the square, at the lofty roofs with their peaked gables, the windows and skylights crammed with anxious faces, and the little niched recesses from which the figures of the Virgin had been carefully removed.
"What a nest of vermin!"
cried he to the captain of hussars.
"What a vile nest of vermin! We shall have work here for the next 8 days.
Hearing that, Uncle Conrad took me by the arm, saying, "Come in, Frederick, come in. They'll pick us out at the first look. It's terrible." He was trembling in his limbs, whilst I felt a cold shiver run down my back. As we were entering the workshop, I saw Aunt Gretel on her knees praying out loud with her hands clasped. I had but just time to push her into the kitchen and shut the door. She might have sent us all to the guillotine with her devotion. Then Uncle and I looked out through the little window panes. The crowd outside were still singing,
"Kazra, the aristocrats to the lantern, the lantern!"
like the grasshoppers that chirp away, unheeding the coming winter, which will shrivel them up in a moment with its frosty breath. A crowd of people were standing in front of our windows, but we could see over their shoulders the hussars drawn up in the crowd, with Citizen Schneider and the great cart in the center near the fountain. 2 strapping fellows with honest, good-humored faces were taking the beams off the cart, and after a little, Romer, the innkeeper, came out with a bottle of brandy and handed it to them. A little withered-looking man, as pale and feeble as a tallow rushlight, with a long, sharp nose and a face like the blade of a razor, and dressed in a short red blouse strapped in tight about the waist, was superintending the work. He looked for all the world like a figure of Punch, but God preserve us from such punches. It was the executioner. Whilst we were still looking at the proceedings I have described, Rebstock, the mayor, an honest vine-grower, grave and broad-shouldered, with an immense 3-cornered hat coming halfway down his back, advanced across the square. Every Tridia and Sextidy, 3rd and 6th day, Rebstock collected the village children together and taught them the Republican Catechism. He was a shrewd, sensible fellow, and as he expected a visit from Citizen Schneider, he had taken the precaution of having a coat made out of a priest's vestments in order to propitiate the scoundrel. As he was approaching, Schneider leaned over his horse's neck and cried out, "Here is the wine-press ready, but where are the grapes?" "What grapes, Citizen Schneider?" "The aristocrats." "There are none here. We are all good patriots." On hearing this, the expression of Schneider's face was fearful to behold. I fancied I saw him once more snatching the roll of papers from the fire.
"You lie!" shouted he. "You are one yourself. What is the meaning of that gold and silver on your clothes, when the Republic has not wherewithal to nourish her children?" "The Citizen Schneider that I am wearing is the priestly vestment. I put it on my back in order to exterminate the hydra of superstition." Then Schneider burst out in a loud laugh, exclaiming, "Well done, I like that. But come, bethink yourself. I am sure you must know of some aristocrats about here." "No, I assure you, they have all made their escape. Our lads are going to look for them at Koblenz, and our very children are beating the charge." "We shall see that," said Schneider. "You look to me to be a true-hearted patriot. Your idea of the vestments pleases me highly. We shall dine with you. It's capital. Ha ha ha!" He held his great paunch with both hands. All the hussars dined with the mayor in company with Schneider. They made a requisition in the village, and everyone sent the best he had. The following day Schneider paid a visit to the club, and heard the children recite the Rights of Man in chorus.
Everything we thought would have passed off quietly. Unfortunately, a man who had once been a bell ringer in the church, and on that account fancied himself an aristocrat, had hid himself in the hayloft of the Golden Lion. And the hussars, when looking for a truss or two of hay, ferreted him out, and wanted to know why the poor devil had concealed himself. Schneider, on inquiry, found out that he had rung the church bells, and had him guillotined while they were sitting at dinner. This was a great vexation to Rebstock, but he daren't say anything for fear of being guillotined himself. Schneider went away the same day, to the great satisfaction of the whole village. That was the way I made the acquaintance of the good apostle again, and I have often thought since that if my father had known what was to happen, he would have left him to perish in the Schlaucht. As for the old mayor of Wettenheim, people never forgave him for having made a coat out of a priest's vestments, and the old women especially, whom he had saved from being guillotined by this means, showered down maledictions on his head, which was certainly very unjust. One day when I was talking to him amongst his vines about this affair, he smiled sadly and said, "If I'd allowed Schneider to cut their heads off, they would now be in the trough of the guillotine, in spite of vestments and everything else, nor would I have had any special cause to reproach myself. I should only have acted as basely as everyone else." Then I thought to myself, this poor old Rebstock is right. Save people from death, and 10 to 1 the half of them will load you with curses, and the other half send you to the guillotine. Not very encouraging, truly. If men did not do these good deeds from a spirit of Christian charity, they would be the greatest fools in existence. It's sad to say it, but it's the truth. End of Section 8. End of Stories of the Rhine by Erckmann-Chatrian.